The deed cost $5, the price of a good pig, and the family that signed it over laughed as the ink dried. A young widow in a black mourning dress stood alone in a Virginia mountain village, her worn boots sinking into the mud, while 100 faces watched from behind lace curtains, and not one of them offered a word. The lane to her inheritance disappeared into a tunnel of wild grape and hawthorn, so thick that even the August light couldn't follow her through. What waited at the other end had not been a home for half a century. 3 stories of blue-gray stone slumping against the hillside, its roof shedding slate like dead skin, its windows staring back at her like hollow eyes. She pushed against the front door with everything she had, but the house refused to let her in. That night she slept in the stable with only an old dog pressed against her side, while somewhere deep inside those walls, a sound began, a steady, rhythmic tapping that was too deliberate to be wind. Before dawn she found words carved into the beam above her head, left by a hand that had been dead for 40 years. JB, the garden will wait. What would you do if the family that was meant to protect you instead cast you out with an inheritance designed to destroy you? For the sum of $5 a pittance required by law. They handed a young widow the deed to a place no living soul had dared to enter for half a century. A crumbling manor that was more grave than residence. They laughed as she took it. Her pale face held steady, a mask carved from grief, from resolve, from something harder than either. They were certain she would be begging at the church steps before the first frost touched the Blue Ridge. But the truth waiting inside those collapsing walls, buried behind decades of deliberate neglect, sealed away by a forgotten promise, between 2 men who understood what mattered more than money. That truth was a secret of astonishing value. Settle in. Let us travel back to the red clay roads of 1880s Virginia, to a story of quiet defiance, of roots deeper than stone, of a remarkable discovery at Briarcliff Hall. The office of Halstead, Merriweather, and Cobb occupied the 2nd floor of a narrow brick building on East Grace Street in Richmond, Virginia. The room smelled of old leather pipe tobacco residue, baked into the curtains over many summers, the faintly sour scent of legal ink drying on documents that would alter lives. It was the kind of place where fortunes were divided, where families were severed with the stroke of a pen, where the machinery of law ground human bonds into dust with polite efficiency. Verity Hollis sat in a straight-back chair near the window, her hands folded in her lap, her spine refusing to touch the cushion behind her. She was 21 years old, a widow of 4 months. The black wool of her mourning dress absorbed the August heat rather than deflecting it, turning the fabric into a second skin that clung to her shoulders, her wrists, the hollow of her throat. A bead of sweat traced down her temple, but she did not lift a hand to wipe it away. She would not give them the satisfaction of watching her fidget. Across the polished mahogany desk, her brother-in-law arranged his performance. Desmond Hollis was a man who occupied space the way a bull occupies a pasture, not because the pasture belonged to him, but because no one had yet found reason to build a fence. He was broad-shouldered, ruddy-faced, his cheeks permanently flushed from generous portions of bourbon, consumed at business dinners, where the Hollis family's timber interests were celebrated with raised glasses. His coat was fine English tweed imported at considerable expense, worn with the casual negligence of a man who had never once worried about where his next meal would come from. He leaned forward now, his thick fingers spread across the desk, as though he were about to push the entire piece of furniture toward her. Briarcliff Hall. His voice boomed with a cheerfulness so false it practically echoed off the oil paintings. The original family seat, been sitting empty a good while, needs a woman's touch. We feel it's only right that Calvin's wife should have a piece of his heritage. Behind him, his wife Blanche, a woman whose angles could cut glass, whose glances could draw blood, smiled from behind her ivory fan. The smile never reached her eyes. It lived only on her mouth, a thin, practiced curve that communicated a single message: you have already lost. The solicitor, a gray man named Cobb, who had been paid handsomely for his neutrality, produced a dry cough. He slid the papers across the polished desk with the careful detachment of a man delivering a death certificate. $5. The transfer price was printed in neat copper plate at the top of the deed. $5, the price of a serviceable plow horse, the cost of a month's rent in a modest boarding house, the sum her father would have called the price of a good pig. It was the price of her exile. Verity picked up the pen. The nib was sharp, freshly cut. The inkwell gleamed. She could feel Desmond watching her, waiting for the crack, the trembling lip, the glistening eye, the small feminine collapse that would confirm everything he believed about her. That she was weak, that she was temporary, that she was a mistake his brother had made in a moment of romantic foolishness, a mistake the family was now correcting with surgical precision. She signed. Her hand did not shake. The letters of her name appeared on the parchment in a steady, legible script, V. Hollis, as final as a headstone inscription. She set the pen down, aligned it parallel to the edge of the desk, folded her hands again. The grief inside her was not a wave threatening to break. It was a stone, cold, dense, lodged behind her sternum, pressing against her lungs with every breath. She had carried it for 4 months. She would carry it further. Desmond's grin widened. He had won. He believed he had won. The Hollis family's problem, the school teacher's daughter, who had somehow bewitched their youngest son into marriage, was now solved. Exiled to a ruin in the mountains, she would fade quietly, return to nothing, become a footnote in the family ledger. What happened next would stay with Verity for weeks. As she rose to leave, as Desmond turned to clap Cobb on the shoulder with the jovial relief of a man who had just closed a profitable deal, the old solicitor did something unexpected. His hand, dry as the parchment she had just signed, brushed against hers. She felt the press of paper, a small folded square, no larger than a postage stamp, pushed into her palm with the deftness of a man who had spent decades handling secrets. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. His were roomy, tired, but behind the fatigue lived something else. Something that looked impossibly like instruction. She closed her fingers around the paper. She did not look at it. She slipped it into the pocket of her dress, alongside the deed, alongside the grief, alongside the cold stone of her determination. She walked out of the office without a backward glance. On the street below, in the punishing Richmond heat, she unfolded the paper. The handwriting was cramped, hurried, different from Cobb's careful legal script, as though someone else had written it, or as though Cobb had written it with his left hand to disguise the source. 7 words: ask Mrs. Fenwick about the East Garden. She did not understand. She tucked the paper away. She had more pressing concerns: a trunk to retrieve from her boarding house, a dog to collect, a journey to begin. But the words nested in her mind like a seed pressed into soil, waiting for the right conditions to split open. The carrier's wagon left Richmond at dawn the following morning, rattling west along the Valley Turnpike toward the Blue Ridge. Verity sat on the bench beside the driver, a man whose face resembled a walnut, deeply creased brown, compressed by decades of sun into something that was less a face than a topographical map of hard living. Her trunk occupied the wagon bed behind them. Beside the trunk, curled on a folded horse blanket, lay Briar. The dog was an old lurcher, gray-muzzled, long-legged, with amber eyes that tracked the world with a quiet, patient intelligence. He had been Calvin's shadow, his hunting companion, his evening fireside partner, the silent witness to a marriage that had burned bright for 2 short years before consumption had claimed the man who had given Verity both his name, his heart, the first home she had ever truly called her own. When Calvin died, the Hollis family had taken everything: the house on Church Hill, the furniture, the silver, the modest savings account at the Planters National Bank. Everything except the dog. They did not want the dog. Briar was too old, too slow, too devoted to the wrong person. He was, in their estimation, worthless. They were wrong about that, as they were wrong about so many things. The journey took 2 days. They crossed the Piedmont, climbed into the foothills, entered the Blue Ridge through a gap where the road narrowed to a single track between walls of chestnut oak poplar trees so tall their canopies formed a cathedral ceiling that filtered the August light into columns of green gold dust. The air changed. Richmond's swampy heat gave way to something cooler, sharper, scented with pine resin, damp stone, the mineral tang of mountain springs cutting through ancient rock. The driver deposited her in the square of Dunmore on the afternoon of the second day. Dunmore was not a town so much as a negotiation between civilization and wilderness. A general store, a blacksmith's forge, a white clapboard church with a steeple that leaned slightly eastward, as though listening for something, a tavern called the Iron Buck, whose sign creaked in the mountain breeze, a scattering of frame houses along 2 muddy streets. That was Dunmore. The entire settlement could have fit inside a single Richmond city block. Verity paid the driver the last of her coins. She watched him go, the wagon diminishing down the road, the sound of hooves fading until the only noise was the creak of the tavern sign, the distant ring of the blacksmith's hammer, the whisper of wind through the oaks that lined the square. She stood alone, a slight figure in a plain black dress. Her worn boots, the same pair she had walked to church in, walked to market in, walked behind Calvin's coffin, and sank into the damp earth. Briar pressed his gray muzzle into her hand. Warm. Solid. The only warmth left in her world. She felt the weight of observation. Behind lace curtains, behind half-closed shutters, behind the glass of the general store, the citizens of Dunmore watched. They knew who she was. News in the Blue Ridge traveled faster than horses carried from parish to parish on the tongues of circuit riders. Mail carriers, itinerant peddlers, who traded gossip as readily as tin pots. She was the Richmond girl, the widow Hollis, the fool who had accepted Briarcliff. The weight of their judgment pressed down on her like a physical hand on each shoulder. She pulled her thin shawl tighter, lifted her chin, began walking. Nobody offered directions. She found the lane herself, or rather the lane found her, presenting itself at the edge of the settlement as a gap between two ancient stone walls, barely wide enough for a cart, disappearing into a tunnel of overgrown hawthorn wild grape Virginia creeper, so thick that the afternoon light barely penetrated. Briar trotted ahead, his tail low, his nose working the unfamiliar scents with an anxiety that mirrored her own. After a mile, the green tunnel opened. She saw it for the first time, silhouetted against a sky-bruised purple with approaching evening. Briarcliff Hall was not a house. It was a ghost. 3 stories of blue-gray Virginia stone, the kind quarried from the mountains themselves, it slumped against the hillside, as though the effort of standing had finally exhausted it. The roof slate tiles, hauled up from the valley at enormous expense by men long dead, had shed itself in cascades of decay, leaving skeletal timber rafters exposed to rain-snow, the relentless cycle of freeze-thaw that turned solid wood to sponge over decades. Windows stared at her like vacant eyes, some boarded with planks that had themselves begun to rot. Others shattered the surviving shards of glass, catching the dying light with the dull glint of broken teeth. Wisteria thick as a man's forearm, alive, in a way the house was not, crawled across the entire facade, pulling stones loose from their mortar, masking the original architectural lines beneath a living shroud of green. The great stone chimney on the east wing had partially collapsed, its rubble scattered across what might once have been a sweeping lawn, but was now a meadow of goldenrod, thistle, wild aster. The air smelled of damp earth, decaying wood, the faintly sweet rot of vegetation, reclaiming what man had briefly borrowed. For a moment, her resolve cracked. Not broke, cracked the way a window pane cracks from a thrown stone, the fracture visible, but the glass still holding. The Hollis family had not merely given her a ruin. They had given her a burial site. They had sent her here to be crushed by the sheer tonnage of decay, to surrender, to crawl back to Richmond, confirming every contemptuous assumption they had ever made about the schoolteacher's daughter who had dared to marry above her station. Briar whimpered softly. She rested her hand on his rough head. The fur beneath her palm was real. The ridge of his skull was solid. The warmth of his body was undeniable. She drew a breath that tasted of mountain air, of ruin, of the faintest sweetness she could not identify. The house was a challenge, a final insult from people who had never wanted her. Very well. Let them watch. She would not break, not here, not yet. The empty space of her future was terrifying, a blank page with no author, but it was hers alone. She approached the great oak door. The wood had been bleached silver by decades of sun, split along its grain by years of rain freezing in its cracks. The iron handle was rusted solid, fused to the plate by oxidation. She pushed with her full weight. Nothing. She threw her shoulder against it. The door did not acknowledge her existence. She circled the house, her boots squelching through marshy ground where the drainage had long since failed. Around the east side, past the chimney rubble, she found a low window leading into what must have been a scullery. The glass broken clean away, the frame rotted soft. She hitched up her skirts, draped her shawl over the jagged remnants of glass in the frame, gripped the sill with both hands, pulled herself through. She landed on a floor slick with moss, damp, something organic she preferred not to identify. The air inside was colder than the mountain evening, more stagnant. The silence was absolute, the kind of silence that has weight, that occupies space, that pushes against your eardrums with the pressure of decades of abandonment. Broken only by the steady drip of water falling from the ceiling into a puddle she could hear but not see. This was her inheritance. A waterlogged shell filled with shadows, with the ghosts of lives extinguished before she was born. She spent that first night not inside the house, but huddled with Briar in a small, relatively dry corner of the adjoining stable, a stone structure that smelled of old hay. Dry earth, the faint ghost of horses long since gone. The great house loomed beside her in the darkness, a sleeping giant she was not yet brave enough to wake. She slept fitfully. Briar curled against her side, his breathing steady, his body a furnace in the cold mountain night. Above them, through a gap in the stable roof, stars burned with the fierce clarity that only mountain darkness permits. No gas lamps, no city glow, nothing between her eyes, the universe except 10,000 feet of clean Virginia air. Sometime before dawn, as the sky began its slow transition from black to the deep blue that precedes sunrise, she noticed something carved into the wooden beam above her head. She had to strain to read it in the near darkness, tracing the letters with her fingertips like a blind woman reading scripture. J.B. The garden will wait. J.B. She did not know anyone with those initials. The carving was old, the letters soft-edged the wood around them darkened by decades of exposure. Someone had stood in this exact spot perhaps decades ago, perhaps longer, taken a knife or a chisel to the beam, left these 6 words. A message to no one, a promise to something. The garden will wait. For what? For she filed the letters alongside the solicitor's note in the growing archive of things she did not understand. She had more immediate problems. The sun was rising, painting the broken roofline of Briarcliff Hall in shades of copper rose. She was hungry, she was cold, she was alone. These were the facts. Facts could be addressed. Mysteries could wait. But they would not wait long. The sound of wheels on the rutted lane reached her before she saw the wagon. It was mid-morning, the mist still clinging to the hollows between the hills, when a battered farm cart emerged from the green tunnel, pulled by a dun-colored mule, with the resigned expression common to mules everywhere. The man driving it was perhaps 60, lean as a fence post, with a face weathered to the color of old brick, the face of a man who had spent his entire life outdoors, whose skin had been shaped by every season Virginia could produce. I wore a canvas coat, a battered hat, boots that had been resoled so many times the original leather was more memory than material. He pulled the mule to a halt, climbed down with the careful deliberation of a man whose joints had begun to lodge formal complaints, walked to the back of the cart. Without ceremony, without greeting, he began unloading. A sack of cornmeal, a tin of lard, a box of tallow candles, a bar of lye soap, a bundle of hand tools, a hammer, a handsaw, a box of nails, a ball of twine. He stacked these items on the ground beside the stable with the efficiency of a man performing a duty he had rehearsed in his mind during the long drive from wherever he had come. Only when the cart was empty did he turn to face her. Your father was a good man, Verity. His voice was low, roughened by years of calling across fields, of speaking to animals in the patient tones they required. He shouldn't have died when he did. Your mother shouldn't have gone before him. Calvin shouldn't have followed. None of it was right. None of it was fair. She recognized him then. Mr. Calder. He had been a tenant farmer on land adjacent to her father's small property in Albemarle County, back when her father was alive, back when the world made sense. He had attended her wedding. She remembered him standing at the back of the church, hat in hand, looking uncomfortable in a borrowed coat. He had not attended Calvin's funeral. She had not blamed him. Richmond was a long way from the mountains. He reached into his coat, produced a small leather purse heavy for its size. He pressed it into her hand with the same firmness her father had used when pressing a book into her hands as a child. Here, take this. It matters. It's not much. Enough for the first weeks. Your father... He stopped. His jaw worked the muscles beneath the weathered skin, tightening, releasing. She had the sudden piercing impression that he was deciding how much to say, that he was standing at a fork in a conversation, choosing one path, leaving the other for later. Your father mentioned this house to me once. Years ago. He said it held something important, something worth more than money. He met her eyes, his gaze direct, unflinching, carrying the weight of a promise made to a dead man. I asked him what he meant. He just shook his head. He told me I'd know when the time came. He paused. I don't know yet, but I figured bringing you flour was a good place to start. He departed without further explanation, the mule picking its way back down the rutted lane with the philosophical indifference of its species. Verity stood holding the purse, feeling the weight of coins through the leather, feeling the heavier weight of his words pressing against the other mysteries accumulating in her mind. Her father had known about this house. Her father, a school teacher, a naturalist, a man who spent his evenings pressing wildflowers between the pages of borrowed encyclopedias, had known about Briarcliff Hall, had spoken of it with reverence, had told Calder it held something worth more than money. Why, how, the questions multiplied. But the morning was advancing. Her stomach was empty. The house was waiting. She built a fire in the stable using dry wood from a collapsed partition wall. She mixed cornmeal with water, cooked it on a flat stone balanced over the flames, a crude, gritty porridge that tasted of smoke necessity. She shared it with Briar, who ate without complaint as dogs do. Then she squared her shoulders. It was time to enter the house properly. She could not live in the stable forever. The iron bar from Calder's tool bundle served as a lever. She drove it into the seam between the great oak doors, set her weight against it, pushed. The wood groaned, a sound almost human in its protest, the voice of a house that had grown accustomed to its solitude that did not welcome intrusion. She pushed harder. The bar bit deeper. With a crack that echoed off the hillside like a rifle shot, the lock surrendered. The doors swung inward, releasing a cloud of dust that had been undisturbed for decades. Motes spinning in the single shaft of morning light that pierced the grime-caked windows of the great hall, dancing with the lazy grace of things that have nowhere to be, nothing to do all the time in the world. The scent hit her first, not the simple smell of damp that she had encountered in the scullery, but something more complex, a layered archaeology of decay. Wet plaster dissolving into powder, wood slowly converting to pulp, fabric rotting on the bones of furniture. Something faintly floral beneath it all, like a memory of perfume, worn by someone who had left the room a century ago. She stepped inside. The great hall rose 2 stories, a staircase at its center, climbing into the gloom of the upper floors. The balustrade had been half consumed by woodworm, the carved newel posts reduced to lace. Furniture stood draped in cobwebs so thick they resembled velvet gray, heavy, undulating slightly in the draft from the open doors. A portrait hung above the fireplace, tilted at an angle that gave its subject the appearance of leaning forward, peering down at her with disapproval. The man in the painting was stern-faced, bearded, dressed in the formal style of 40 years past. In his left hand he held a single flower, pale, delicate, rendered with a precision that suggested the artist had been given specific instructions about the importance of that bloom. She could not identify the species from below. She moved through the ground floor. Each room offered not a repetition of ruin, but a specific, distinct chapter of collapse. The drawing room wallpaper peeling in long, curling strips, revealing blackened plaster beneath a fireplace mantel crowded with porcelain plates, each one painted with a different flower she would later learn to identify as varieties of orchid. The dining room, a long table still set with china, the plates furred with dust, a chandelier hanging at a dangerous angle from a ceiling stained brown by decades of water intrusion. The morning room, a pianoforte with yellowed keys, its legs sinking into floorboards that yielded under her weight with the spongy give of rotten wood. The study off the main hall stopped her. Here among the expected debris was a map. Framed, hung on the wall, glass cracked, but the document beneath still legible. It showed the mountain ranges of Western Virginia, the Blue Ridge, the Alleghenies, the Great Smokies further south, with small red circles marking specific locations. Beside each circle, in a cramped, precise hand, someone had written dates, brief notations. See a call confirmed May 1836. See Reginae 3 specimens, September 1838. See Parviflorum remarkable colony, June 1840. The initials at the bottom of the map, JB, the same initials carved into the stable beam. JB, the map, was a record of botanical expeditions. Someone had traveled these mountains methodically over years, collecting specimens of what appeared to be orchids. Native orchids, the flowers on the porcelain plates in the drawing room, the single bloom held by the man in the portrait. The house was saturated with orchids, not the plants themselves, but their images, their records, the traces of someone's consuming obsession. She found the room she would claim. It was tucked behind the main staircase, accessible through a low, sturdy door, the servants' quarters. Small, stone-flagged floor, a large fireplace blackened by generations of cooking fires, a single window, its glass miraculously intact, looking out onto a walled garden, now choked with thorns. Wild rose, a single dogwood tree, growing at an angle that suggested it had spent its entire life reaching for a light source that kept moving. The air here was cold, but clean, less haunted than the grand rooms, as though the ghosts of Briarcliff preferred more impressive accommodations. A simple wooden table occupied the center of the room. One chair, nothing else. She set her trunk against the wall, her shawl over the trunk as a pillow. She swept the floor with a bundle of twigs. She cleared the fireplace of old bird nests, fallen soot, the desiccated body of a bat that crumbled to dust at her touch. She hauled water from a stone-lined well in the courtyard, scrubbed the flagstones until her knuckles were raw. She worked without stopping, without thinking, because thinking was a luxury she could not afford. Thinking led to Calvin. Thinking led to the empty space on the other side of the bed that would never be filled again. Working led only to the next task, the next stone to scrub, the next cobweb to sweep. Working was survival. On the third evening, she built her first fire inside Briarcliff Hall. The dry wood salvaged from a collapsed partition in the servants' passage crackled, popped, caught with an enthusiasm that seemed almost personal, as though the fireplace had been waiting decades for this exact moment. Golden light pushed back the shadows. The stone walls absorbed the warmth held, it radiated it back. The room transformed. It was small, it was bare. It was a fraction of the ruined enormity that surrounded it, but it was for the first time habitable. Hers. That night she slept inside the walls of Briarcliff Hall. Briar curled on a piece of old sacking beside the hearth, his breathing a metronome of peace. The fire settled into embers. The silence of the house pressed in from all sides, but it was a different silence now. Not hostile, watchful, as though the house had opened one eye, regarded this small woman who had built a fire in its belly, decided to reserve judgment. Just before sleep took her, she heard it, a sound from somewhere deep within the structure, rhythmic, steady, deliberate as a heartbeat. Tap, tap, tap. Too regular to be whined, too purposeful to be a loose shutter. A knocking from inside the walls themselves, as though something trapped behind stone, behind brick, behind decades of sealed silence was asking patiently, persistently to be let out. She told herself it was the house settling the way old houses do. She told herself this, but she did not believe it. Sleep came anyway, pulling her down into a darkness warmer than the one outside. Her first trip to Dunmore for supplies was an exercise in quiet endurance. She walked the 2 miles back to the village, a list in her hand. Flour, salt, more candles, a tin of matches. The whispers preceded her through the town like the bow wave of a ship, parting conversations, turning faces, creating a zone of silence that moved with her from the baker's counter to the shelves of the general store. They were not cruel, not precisely. Their behavior carried the careful distance people maintain around the terminally ill, the already condemned. They spoke to her with the exaggerated politeness reserved for those who would soon cease to matter. She was counting her remaining coins, subtracting the cost of salt from the cost of candles, performing the arithmetic of poverty when the light from the storefront was blocked. Desmond Hollis filled the doorway like a cork in a bottle, his tweed coat immaculate, his face flushed with health satisfaction, the particular glow of a man who has traveled a considerable distance for the sole pleasure of witnessing another person's misery. Well, well, the lady of the manor comes to town. He stepped inside. The other customers, the blacksmith's wife, 2 farm women, the shopkeeper himself fell silent with the sudden complete stillness of prey animals detecting a predator. Their eyes moved between Desmond Verity back again. The air in the store thickened. His voice dripped with the syrup of false concern. How do you find your new estate, Verity? Bit of a fixer-upper, I imagine. She felt the heat climb her neck, her cheeks, the tips of her ears. The anger was a living thing, a creature with claws climbing her rib cage demanding release. She pushed it down. She locked it behind the same cold stone that held her grief. She met his gaze. Her expression gave him nothing, no fear, no shame, no anger. A locked door. It is quiet. It is mine. Desmond produced a laugh, not a chuckle, not a snicker, but a full, booming, performative bark designed to fill the room, to make every witness complicit in the humiliation. Yours it belongs, to the crows, to the ivy. You'll come crawling back to Richmond by Christmas, mark my words. He swept a mocking bow, the kind of bow a man makes when he believes the person before him is beneath genuine courtesy, turned toward the door. Then he paused. He leaned toward the shopkeeper Garvey, a man with the round, cautious face of someone who understood that survival in a small town meant knowing which side of every fence to stand on. Desmond's voice dropped, but not enough. Not nearly enough. Don't extend her credit, Garvey. Anyone who floats her a line of debt, I'll remember it. The Hollis family has a long memory when it comes to our business partners. He left. The bell above the door jingled with obscene cheerfulness. The silence he left behind was not empty. It was stuffed with discomfort, with secondhand shame, with the particular cowardice of people who have witnessed an injustice but lack the courage, the economic freedom to object. Garvey avoided her eyes as he wrapped her purchases. The farm women studied the floorboards with sudden fascination. The blacksmith's wife, the only one who met Verity's gaze, offered a single, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture so small it could be denied. But it was there. Verity saw it. She took her parcels, walked out. She made it as far as the churchyard before the composure cracked. Not broke, cracked. She sat on a cold stone bench beside the low wall that separated the living from the dead, her packages in her lap, her hands trembling with the aftershock of controlled fury. Briar rested his head on her knee, his warm gaze looking up at her with the simple, devastating empathy that dogs offer without condition, without judgment. The church behind her was old fieldstone small, its walls thick enough to stop a musket ball, built in an era when churches in the Virginia mountains served double duty as fortifications. It felt solid, permanent, a counterweight to the fragility of everything else. She became aware of being watched, not the hostile surveillance of the townspeople, but something more deliberate. An old woman, her spine curved into a permanent question mark, by decades of labor, was kneeling beside a grave 3 rows into the churchyard, methodically pulling weeds from the base of a limestone marker, with fingers so gnarled they resembled the roots she was extracting. She worked with the slow mechanical patience of someone performing a ritual rather than a task, the kind of tending that continues long after the person being tended has ceased to care. The woman straightened slowly, painfully, the way a rusty hinge opens her eyes, pale as a winter sky, milky with the beginnings of cataracts settled on Verity. She did not offer pity. She did not offer scorn. She offered only a look long, measuring the kind of look that strips away surfaces to examine the structure beneath. "You're the one at Briarcliff." Not a question, a confirmation. Verity nodded. The old woman whom Verity would later learn was Mrs. Fenwick, a widow herself for 50 years, the oldest living resident of Dunmore, took a slow step closer. Her dress was black, faded to the color of charcoal by years of washing of son of wear. Her hands hanging at her sides were the hands of a woman who had never in her life been idle. "They say it's a lost cause." Her voice was thin, reedy, the sound of wind passing through dry grass. "They say the house is dead." She paused. The pause had weight, had gravity, drew the moment tight as a bowstring. But some houses remember what men forget. The words landed in the space between them like a stone dropped into still water. Verity felt the ripples. Then Mrs. Fenwick added something more. She moved closer, lowered her voice, not because she feared being overheard, but because what she was about to say carried the particular gravity of information passed down through generations. Information that existed outside the official record, outside the documents in solicitors' offices, outside the world of men like Desmond Hollis. "My grandfather worked for the man who built the East Wing. The old Master Blackwell was his name. He paid my grandfather to keep the East Wing breathing. My father continued after him. Then me." She looked at her own hands as though seeing them for the first time. "I'm too old now, haven't climbed that hill in 20 years. Don't have the key, never did. Never knew what was inside. Only knew that the rainwater gutters on the east roof had to stay clear, that the vents in the foundation couldn't be blocked. My grandfather's instructions. Never questioned them. Never needed to." She turned away, began shuffling back toward the graves, her work unfinished. She paused once more without turning around. $5 they gave you." It was not a question. That's what they think a house is worth. But a house isn't walls. A house is what it keeps. She disappeared among the tilting headstones, leaving Verity on the bench with a head full of new questions layered over old ones. J.B., who was now Blackwell. The east wing sealed, bricked up, its chimney collapsed. A family paid for generations to keep it breathing. Breathing. Not a word you use for an empty room. You used it for something alive. Verity gathered her supplies. She stood. Her hands had stopped trembling. The encounter with Desmond still burned, but it burned differently now. Not with the acid of humiliation, but with the fuel of purpose. The old woman's words, "Some houses remember what men forget," joined the growing collection of fragments in her mind. The solicitor's note, the carved initials, Calder's revelation about her father, the tapping in the walls. They were pieces of something. She could not yet see the shape they formed, but she could feel its edges, the way you feel the edge of a table in a dark room by collision, by contact, by the bruise that tells you something solid is there. She walked back to Briarcliff. The 2 miles felt shorter this time. The lane felt less like a tunnel, more like a passage. Briar walked beside her, his tail marginally higher than the day before. The weeks that followed were measured not in days, but in tasks, completed in rooms reclaimed in small victories, won against the house's decades of decline. She patched the scullery roof with salvaged slates, teaching herself the craft through trial-error bloody knuckles. She reglazed the window in the servants' quarter with a pane of glass purchased from a traveling glazier who passed through Dunmore, learning the technique of setting putty from a water-stained manual she found in the study. She cleared the great hall of the worst debris, swept out the accumulated detritus of 50 years. Dead leaves, bird droppings. The skeletal remains of small animals that had entered through broken windows found no exit. Each room she cleaned revealed new details about the man who had built the East Wing. More botanical drawings, more pressed specimens in frames, more evidence of a mind consumed by a single magnificent obsession. The rhythm of labor became her salvation, mornings gathering firewood from the oak-hickory forest behind the house, dragging fallen limbs back to the courtyard, splitting them with an axe she found hanging in the stable. Its handle cracked, its blade dulled but serviceable, after she spent an afternoon on the blacksmith's whetstone in Dunmore. Afternoons, the slow physical work of making the West Wing habitable room by room, stone by stone. The work silenced the grief. The work gave her hands a purpose that her heart could not yet find. Dunmore adjusted its opinion of her with the glacial slowness of small communities confronting evidence that contradicts their assumptions. The whispers did not cease, but their character shifted from the confident mockery of people watching a predicted failure unfold to the bewildered murmur of people watching something they had not predicted at all. She was still there. She had not fled. She had not collapsed. She was patching a roof. She was carrying slates up a hill. She was splitting firewood with an axe. The baker began adding an extra loaf to her order. "For the dog," he muttered, his eyes fixed on the counter, the admission of respect too uncomfortable to make directly. The blacksmith had sharpened her axe without charge. Garvey himself, caught between his fear of Desmond's long memory, his grudging admiration for Verity's persistence, had begun slipping an extra box of matches into her order. His silent, cowardly, insufficient act of rebellion against the man who had threatened his livelihood. Then in the quiet of a Tuesday afternoon, with autumn light slanting low through dusty windows, something broke the pattern. She was working through the West Wing library. The worst room yet, its shelves collapsed, its books reduced to moldering pulp, the ceiling partially caved in, exposing the rotted joists of the floor above. She was shoveling debris into a barrow, working mechanically, her mind elsewhere, when her shovel struck wood that did not yield. She looked up. One section of shelving, a tall, narrow bookcase built flush into the wall between two windows, stood intact. Not merely intact, pristine. While everything surrounding it was buried under a thick gray blanket of dust draped in cobwebs dense enough to catch light, this single bookcase gleamed. The dark wood shone with a faint luster, a warmth, as if someone had polished it recently. Not decades ago. Recently. She set down the shovel, crossed the room, extended her hand, ran her fingertips along the surface. No dust, no grime. The wood was smooth, warm, alive in a way that nothing else in the house was alive. A faint scent rose from the surface lemon oil. Beeswax, the smell of care, the smell of maintenance, in a house that had been abandoned for 50 years. The books on the shelves were volumes of botany, native orchids of the Blue Ridge, hybridization techniques for temperate cypripedium, the language of flowers. Their leather bindings were dry but intact, untouched by the damp that had destroyed everything else in the room. Everything else in the house. They were protected, preserved, curated. The bookcase was a single orderly sentence in a long, rambling paragraph of chaos. It was a detail that refused to fit a note played in the wrong key, a question asked in a voice so quiet you had to stop breathing to hear it. Why this bookcase? Why these books? Books who had tended this one small spot while the rest of the house drowned in neglect. The house was speaking to her. Not in groans, not in creaks, not in the settling sounds of old structures adjusting to their own weight. It was speaking in whispers of inconsistency, in a clean shelf surrounded by filth, in a draft from behind a wooden panel, in a rhythmic tapping that came from inside walls that should have contained nothing but stone. She was beginning to listen. Then came the letter. It arrived not by post but by revelation. She found it in the study slipped between the pages of a leather-bound volume of Thoreau that had survived the damp by virtue of its position on an upper shelf. A single sheet of heavy writing paper folded once the creases sharp despite its age. The handwriting was the same cramped, precise script she had seen on the botanical map, the hand of J.B., the hand of Blackwell. It was addressed to her father, not by name, by description. My dear friend Whitmore, the teacher of natural philosophy, the man who understands that a flower is not decoration, but testimony. The letter was short. Its contents detonated in her chest like a charge of black powder. Old friend, if the day comes when your daughter needs shelter, send her to Briarcliff. The house will care for her as she will care for it. There is more here than walls, more than stone. What I have built in the East Wing is my life's testament, my answer to the sons who see only timber when they look at a forest. She will understand. You understood. That is enough. J.B. Verity read the letter 3 times. The third time her vision blurred, not with tears, with the sudden vertiginous understanding that her presence at Briarcliff was not an accident. Not entirely. Her father had known this house, had known the man who built its East Wing, had known or at least suspected that something of value lay sealed behind its bricked-up walls. I had never told her. He had died before he could. But he had told Calder. He had told someone. He had ensured that if the worst came, if his daughter found herself alone, impoverished, exiled, there would be a thread, however thin, leading her to this place. The grief she had carried as a cold stone shifted. It did not warm. It did not dissolve. But it changed shape from a weight pressing down to a hand pressing forward. Her father was not here. Calvin was not here. But their absence was not emptiness. It was direction. She held the letter against her chest. She closed her eyes. Behind her lids she saw not darkness, but the shape of something forming a pattern, emerging from fragments, the way a constellation emerges when you connect stars that seemed until that moment to be scattered without purpose. The next morning a letter arrived at Briarcliff by a different means entirely. A boy from Dunmore, the shopkeeper, Garvey's son, a freckled child of 12 who rode up the lane on a swayback pony, too old for farm work, delivered it to the stable door, thrust it into her hands, retreated at speed. The envelope bore the letterhead of a law office in Richmond. The letter inside was from Desmond's attorney. Its language was precise, formal, merciless. Mrs. Hollis, you are hereby notified that Mr. Desmond Hollis intends to pursue legal action for the recovery of the property known as Briarcliff Hall on the grounds that the current occupant has permitted the estate to fall into a condition of dangerous disrepair constituting a public hazard. Mr. Hollis offers as an alternative to litigation to repurchase the property at the original transfer price of $5. You have 60 days from the date of this letter to respond. Sincerely, J. Pembroke Crawford Escarso, 60 days. She read it again. The deadline was a noose elegantly tied placed around her neck with the courtesy of a formal salutation. The ruthlessness of a man who understood that poverty time are the same weapon wielded at different speeds. Desmond did not merely want her to fail. He wanted her failure documented, legalized, stamped with the seal of the Commonwealth of Virginia. He wanted the deed back. He wanted the house back. Why, the question nagged. He had given it away as a joke, as a punishment, as a means of exile. Why did he want it returned unless he knew something? Unless the Hollis family or their predecessors, the sons of Blackwell, who had married into the Hollis line, who had absorbed the Blackwell name into their own, the way timber companies absorb the forests they strip, had always suspected that the sealed East Wing contained something. Something they had never been able to access. Something they had dismissed eventually as emptiness, as the sealed paranoia of a mad old botanist. But what if the dismissal had never been complete? What if Desmond's cruelty in giving her the house had carried within it a secondary calculation? Let the fool open it, let her do the work, then take it back. She set the letter on the table. She placed it beside the letter from Blackwell to her father, beside the scrap of paper from old Cobb, the solicitor beside the memory of Mrs. Fenwick's words, beside the carved initials in the stable beam, beside the clean bookshelf in the ruined library, beside the rhythmic tapping that came each night from deep within the walls. 60 days. The number pressed against her like a second heartbeat. The house was speaking. The clock was ticking. Somewhere behind a wall of brick, behind decades of silence, behind a promise made by a man who loved flowers More than his own sons loved him, something was waiting. She stood at the window of her small room, Briar at her side, looking out at the walled garden where the dogwood tree reached for light it could never quite catch. The evening air smelled of wood smoke from her fire of autumn leaves beginning their slow turn from green to gold, of the particular mineral sharpness that Virginia mountain air carries in the weeks before the first frost. 60 days, she said aloud. Not to Briar, not to the house, to herself, to the woman she was becoming, the woman who would not break, who would not crawl, who would not give Desmond Hollis the satisfaction of her surrender. The tapping began again as darkness fell. Steady, patient. The house asking its question. The house waiting for her answer. She would give it one. Autumn arrived in the Blue Ridge not as a gradual shift, but as a declaration. One morning, the hills were green dense, heavy, saturated with the last moisture of summer. The next, a single maple at the edge of the Briarcliff property turned the color of arterial blood as though it had been wounded in the night, as though the season had drawn first blood from the landscape itself. Within a week, the entire valley was ablaze. Scarlet amber, burnt orange, a deep burgundy that looked almost black in the shadows. The mountains wore their dying colors with the extravagance of an opera singer taking a final bow. It was beautiful. It was also a warning. Every crimson leaf was a clock hand moving. Every frost-silvered morning was a day subtracted from the 60 Desmond's attorney had given her. Verity worked with the focused intensity of a woman building a levee against a rising flood. The labor was no longer about making the house habitable. That minimal victory had been won. It was about making it defensible. Desmond's letter had named dangerous disrepair as his legal weapon, which meant every sagging beam, every missing slate, every shattered pane of glass was ammunition in his arsenal. She needed to strip him of that ammunition, one repair at a time. She developed a system. Each morning before the mist burned off the hollows, she surveyed the exterior, walking the perimeter of the west wing with a stub of carpenter's pencil behind her ear, a scrap of brown paper in her hand, noting every crack, every gap, every place where water could enter, where stone had shifted, where the skeleton of the house was exposed. Afternoons before the repairs themselves. She hauled slates from the collapsed stable, climbing the roof on a ladder she'd assembled from timber, salvaged from a fallen outbuilding. The rungs lashed with rope, because she had no nails long enough, the whole contraption swaying beneath her weight in a way that made her stomach lurch but never made her quit. She mixed mortar from lime she'd bought in Dunmore River sand she'd carried bucket by bucket from the creek below the property water, from the courtyard well. She pointed stonework with a trowel borrowed from the blacksmith's wife, the woman who left peaches on fence posts, who had now progressed to leaving tools with unsigned notes. Return when finished. No hurry. The village was thawing toward her. Not warmth, not yet, but the particular grudging respect that mountain communities reserve for stubbornness they cannot explain. She was still an outsider, still the Richmond widow, still the woman Desmond Hollis had publicly humiliated in Garvey's store. But she was also the woman who climbed her own roof, who split her own wood, who walked 2 miles each way for supplies without complaint, without asking for a ride, without the self-pity that would have given them permission to pity her. The baker's extra loaf had become routine. The blacksmith had sharpened her axe without charge. Garvey himself, caught between his fear of Desmond's long memory, his grudging admiration for Verity's persistence, had begun slipping an extra box of matches into her order. His silent, cowardly, insufficient act of rebellion against the man who had threatened his livelihood. She was 41 days into the 60 when Mr. Calder returned. He came in the early morning, his mule picking its way up the lane through a carpet of fallen leaves. The cart carried no supplies, this time only. Calder himself sitting stiffly on the bench, his hat pulled low, his face carrying the particular expression of a man who has been arguing with his own conscience for weeks, who has finally lost the argument. Briar recognized the mule before Verity recognized the man trotting to the gate with his tail wagging at the measured, dignified pace of an old dog who remembers kindness. Calder climbed down. He did not unload anything. He did not perform any of the practical rituals that had characterized his first visit. He stood in the courtyard, his hands in his coat pockets, his eyes moving over the house, noting the fresh mortar, the replaced slates, the window that now held glass instead of a board, with the careful attention of a man taking inventory before a confession. Verity brought him inside. She had a fire going. It was early October now. the mornings carrying a bite that reached through wool, through skin into bone. She made coffee from the small supplies she'd been hoarding, the dark liquid, a luxury she rationed as carefully as ammunition. They sat at the wooden table in her small room, the servants' quarters that had become her entire world. Briar settled at Calder's feet with the comfortable familiarity of a dog who understood that this man belonged to the same category as his lost master, quiet, steady, trustworthy. Calder held the cup without drinking. Steam rose between his hands, curling into the cold air. She waited. She had learned in these weeks of solitude that silence was not emptiness, but space for truth to find its footing, to gather the courage to step forward. "I wasn't entirely honest with you, Verity, when I came before." His voice was lower than she remembered, roughened by whatever internal debate had brought him back. "I told you your father mentioned this house, that he said it held something important. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth." He set the cup down. He looked at her directly, his weathered face holding an expression she had seen on her father's face in the final weeks of his illness, the look of a man deciding to trust someone with something fragile. "Your father didn't just mention this house. He gave me instructions. Specific instructions laid out over the course of 3 conversations in the last year of his life. He knew he was dying. The consumption was taking him the same way it would take Calvin 2 years later. He paused over the cruelty of that cemetery father, then son-in-law, both consumed by the same disease, both leaving Verity behind. He told me that if you ever found yourself alone, truly alone, without resources, without family, without options, I was to make certain you reached Briarcliff. Not suggest it, not mention it, make certain." Verity's hands tightened around her own cup. The ceramic was warm against her palms, a counterpoint to the cold spreading through her chest. She had suspected some version of this since finding Blackwell's letter. But suspicion was a shadow. It occupied the same space as truth without carrying the same weight. Hearing it confirmed was different. Hearing it confirmed meant her father had known, had planned, had set in motion a chain of events that led from his deathbed to this ruined house on this Virginia hillside. Calder continued, "He told me about the solicitor, old Cobb. Said Cobb owed him a favor from years back, something about Cobb's son failing a botany examination that your father allowed him to retake. Small favor, large consequence. Your father wrote to Cobb before he died, told him that if the Hollis family ever transferred Briarcliff to you, Cobb was to give you a message. 7 words. Ask Mrs. Fenwick about the East Garden, the note in her pocket, the cramped handwriting she had attributed to Cobb's caution. It was her father's handwriting. Her father's words written before his death, held in trust by a solicitor who owed a school teacher a small old debt delivered across the gap between the living and the dead at exactly the right moment. The chain was not coincidence. It was construction. Why didn't he tell me himself? The question came out harder than she intended, edged with something that was not quite anger, not quite grief, but lived in the territory between them. He had a year. He had 3 conversations with you. Why not 1 conversation with me? Calder's jaw worked. Because he didn't know it would be needed. He hoped Calvin would live. He hoped the Hollis family would treat you decently. He prepared for the worst without believing the worst would come. The old farmer's eyes glistened briefly, a flash of moisture that he blinked away with the practiced speed of a man who had buried his own wife, his own children, his own hopes in the unforgiving soil of the Blue Ridge. He was protecting you from a fear you didn't need to carry. He was wrong about that, but he was right about the house. She sat with this for a long time. The fire crackled. Briar's breathing was a steady counterpoint to the silence. Somewhere in the walls of Briarcliff Hall, the tapping continued, faint, rhythmic, patient, as it had every night since her arrival. What did he know about this place, Mr. Calder? What did he know about Blackwell? Calder shook his head slowly. Not as much as you might think. He knew Josiah Blackwell by reputation. They corresponded, your father told me. Letters between 2 men who shared a love of growing things. Your father was a school teacher who pressed wildflowers. Blackwell was a wealthy man who built glass cathedrals for orchids. They were not equals in station, but they were equals in obsession. He stood the chair, scraping on the stone floor. Your father believed Blackwell had hidden something in the East Wing, something botanical, something alive. He never saw it himself. He never had the chance. But he believed it was there waiting for a keeper. He left her with that word, keeper, not owner, not inheritor. Keeper, a word that implied responsibility, Stewardship, the kind of relationship you have with a living thing that depends on your care. She turned it over in her mind as Calder's mule carried him back down the lane, as the morning mist retreated up the hillsides, as the autumn sun lower. Now its angle sharper, its warmth thinner, climbed above the ridge. The bookcase waited. She had delayed investigating it further, caught between the urgency of Desmond's deadline, the demanding physical labor of keeping the house from collapsing around her. But Calder's confession had shifted the balance. The practical could no longer outweigh the purposeful. The clean bookshelf in the ruined library was not a curiosity, it was an invitation. The house had placed it there, preserved it across 5 decades of abandonment, kept it polished with oils that should have evaporated years ago, maintained in defiance of every natural law governing neglect. It was asking her to pay attention. She went to the library that afternoon. The room had not improved since her last visit. The collapsed shelving, the pulp books, the partial cave-in of the ceiling still presented a landscape of thorough destruction. But the single pristine bookcase stood in the midst of it, like a lighthouse in a shipwreck, upright, luminous, impossible. Briar followed her in his nails clicking on the bare floorboards. He settled in the doorway, his watchful stare tracking her movements with the focused attention of a hunting dog who senses that the quarry is close but cannot yet identify the scent. She began removing the books, one at a time. Carefully, with the reverence her father had taught her to show to bound pages, hold from the spine, not the cover. Support the weight from beneath. Never crack a binding past its natural resistance. She placed each volume on the floor in the order she removed it, creating neat stacks that mapped the shelves. Native orchids of the Blue Ridge went first, then hybridization techniques for temperate cypripedium, then the language of flowers, then a naturalist's guide to the Allegheny forests, then the cultivation of rare terrestrial orchids in North American climates. Each book was a clue, each title a word in a sentence she was learning to read. The bottom shelf. She reached in her fingers, finding the last volume, a thin, worn copy of something titled simply Notes on Cypripedium. As she lifted it free, her knuckles brushed the wooden back panel of the bookcase. The contact sent a tiny thrill through her hand, not from the temperature of the wood, which was cool, but from the faint, unmistakable sensation of moving air. A draft. Cold, steady, carrying the mineral scent of stone, of enclosed space of air that had been circulating in darkness for decades. She pressed her palm flat against the panel. It vibrated beneath her touch, not from any mechanical source, but from the draft itself, the wood thin enough to flex in the current of air, pushing against it from behind. There was a cavity back there, a space behind the wall. The tapping she had heard every night since her first evening in the house, this was its source. Not ghosts, not settling timbers. A loose panel moving in a draft from a hidden hollow, producing that rhythmic, patient knock that had accompanied her sleep for weeks. She needed a tool. The realization brought her to the small wooden box she had carried from Richmond, the one she had not opened since Calvin's death. It sat in the corner of her room beside her trunk untouched. She had placed it there on her first day, positioned it with the careful deliberation of someone handling an explosive device. The box contained Calvin's personal effects, the things the Hollis family had considered too insignificant to claim. Opening it meant touching his life again. Touching his life meant confronting his absence, not as the abstract cold stone she had been carrying, but as specific tangible objects that had once rested in his hands against his skin and his pockets. She carried the box to the library. She set it on the floor beside the empty bookcase. She lifted the lid. The smell hit her first, the particular heartbreaking scent of a person preserved in objects. Calvin's shaving brush, the badger hair still holding the faintest trace of the sandalwood soap he'd used every morning. His worn copy of Shakespeare's sonnets, the spine cracked at Sonnet 116, the one he'd read aloud to her on their wedding night. His voice stumbling over the iambic pentameter with the endearing clumsiness of a man more comfortable with timber surveys than poetry. A bundle of letters tied with a blue ribbon, her letters to him during their courtship, which he had kept, which the Hollis family had not bothered to read, which still held the ghost of the lavender she had pressed between the pages. She touched the ribbon. She did not untie it. Beneath the letters, nested in a fold of cloth, lay a set of small carpentry tools. Calvin's hobby had been carving wooden birds, mostly small enough to fit in a palm, detailed enough to identify by species. He had carved a wren for their first anniversary. She still had it packed in the trunk, wrapped in a handkerchief. The tools were simple: a whittling knife, a set of gouges, a flat-bladed pry bar, no longer than her hand, designed for delicate work. separating thin pieces of wood without splitting the grain. The pry bar fit her hand as though it had been made for her. The steel was cool-weighted perfectly. She felt Calvin's presence in the balance of it, the hours his fingers had shaped the wooden handle worn smooth by use. He was here, not as a ghost, not as a memory, but as a tool placed in her hand at exactly the moment she needed it. The dead do not abandon us, they equip us. She returned to the bookcase. She inserted the tip of the pry bar into the fine seam where the back panel met the frame. The fit was precise, the gap barely wider than the blade, as though the panel had been designed to be opened by exactly this kind of instrument. She applied pressure. The old wood protested a groan that resonated through the empty library, through the empty house, through the years. She increased the pressure. A corner of the panel cracked, splintered, came free. She worked the blade along the edges methodically, patiently, with the care Calvin would have used. The groaning became a series of sharp pops, old glue releasing its grip, old nails pulling free from old wood. The panel separated from the frame in pieces, each piece revealing more of the space behind. A cavity. Brick lines small, no larger than the interior of a steamer trunk. Dark. Cool. The draft flowing from it now was steady, constant, carrying that mineral scent more strongly. On a small wooden shelf built into the back wall of the cavity, resting as though it had been placed there yesterday, was a single object. A thick, leather-bound ledger. Its cover was embossed with two initials in faded gold, JB. She carried it back to her room with the solemnity of a woman transporting sacred text. The light was failing. October days died quickly in the mountains, the sun dropping behind the western ridge with the abruptness of a curtain falling. She lit 3 candles in extravagance, but this moment demanded illumination. Briar rose from his spot by the fire, crossed the room, laid his head in her lap. His weight was an anchor. His breathing was a clock that measured something other than Desmond's 60 days. She opened the journal. The paper was thick, cream-colored, the kind of stock that cost more than most families in Dunmore earned in a week. The ink had faded from black to a deep, warm brown, the color of walnut stain, of strong tea of earth turned by a plow in spring. The handwriting was the same elegant looping script she had seen on the botanical map on the letter tucked inside the Thoreau, the hand of Josiah Blackwell, the man in the portrait, the man who held an orchid while his painted eyes watched from the great hall. The first entry was dated May 12, 1838. My sons, I fear, see only the land. They see the fields as revenue, the woods as timber, the house as a monument to their own status. They do not see the life that it holds. They do not understand that a man's worth is measured not by what he takes from the earth, but by what he gives back to it. She turned pages. The journal was not an account book, not a record of estate management. It was a chronicle, obsessive, detailed, passionate, of Josiah Blackwell's life's work. How as a botanist, not a gentleman dabbler, not a man who collected pressed flowers as a parlor entertainment, but a serious, self-taught scientist consumed by a singular subject, the orchids of the American mountains. He wrote of expeditions into the Blue Ridge, the Alleghenies, the Great Smokies, journeys lasting weeks during which he climbed ridges, forded creeks, crawled through rhododendron thickets on his hands, his knees searching for wild colonies of native orchids, ladies' slippers, showy orchids, small purple fringed orchids, rattlesnake plantains. He cataloged them with the precision of a census taker: species, location, soil composition, canopy cover, companion plants, bloom dates, pollinator species. Each entry was illustrated with pencil drawings of such delicate accuracy that Verity could almost smell the flowers on the page. But the catalog was only the foundation. The true purpose of the journal, the obsession that burned through every page that gave the handwriting its urgent, forward-leaning slant, was hybridization. Josiah Blackwell was not merely collecting orchids. He was creating them, cross-pollinating species that had never been combined, nurturing the results through years of patient cultivation, discarding failures, refining successes, pursuing a vision that he described with the fervor of a prophet. The entry from September 1839 made her stop breathing. After 11 years of labor, after 200 failed crosses, after 1,000 mornings of checking seedlings that refused to grow after a despair so deep, I considered burning the conservatory to the ground it has bloomed. The cross between C. reginae, C. parviflorum var. Pubescens has produced something that should not exist, something that has never existed in the wild or in any cultivated collection I am aware of. The flower is the color of a winter dawn, palest lilac, the petals veined with a silver so fine it appears to have been drawn by a hand steadier than mine. The labellum is a deep, translucent amethyst. The scent is unlike any orchid I have encountered, honey rain, something I can only describe as the smell of light passing through morning mist. I have named it Cypripedium briarcliffense, the briarcliff orchid. It is my masterpiece. It is the single thing I have done in this life that will outlast me. She read the passage again, then a third time. She understood with the sudden clarity of a landscape revealed by lightning what this house contained, what Josiah Blackwell had hidden, what her father had sensed but never confirmed, what Mrs. Fenwick's family had been paid for decades to protect. The journal's tone shifted after the triumph of the Briarcliff orchid's first bloom. Joy gave way to anxiety. Anxiety curdled into fear. Blackwell's sons, two men, he described with the controlled fury of a father who recognized his own failures mirrored in his offspring, had become aware that the orchid collection had value. Not beauty value, not scientific value, but market value. They had spoken openly at his own dinner table of selling the entire collection to the highest bidder upon his death, of converting the East Wing Conservatory into additional timber storage, of tearing out the glass walls he had installed at ruinous expense, replacing them with functional planking. They see my garden as inventory. They see my life's work as a commodity to be liquidated. They will sell the Briarcliff orchid to some collector in New York who will display it in a heated parlor like a trophy head mounted on a wall. They will destroy what they cannot understand because destruction is easier than comprehension, because money is simpler than meaning. The entries from late 1839 became furtive. The handwriting tightened, grew smaller, as though Blackwell were physically contracting around his secret. He described in meticulous detail a plan of extraordinary audacity. He was converting the entire East Wing into a sealed, self-sustaining sanctuary. The conservatory's glass walls would remain providing light. A system of copper cisterns mounted on the roof would collect rainwater, channeling it through clay pipes, gravity-fed, requiring no pumps, no human intervention to each individual pot. Foundation vents fitted with metal louvers designed to open-close with temperature changes would circulate air. The principle was not original. Virginia tobacco farmers had used similar gravity irrigation systems in their curing barns for generations, but the scale was unprecedented. An entire wing of a manor house converted into a life support system for orchids. He would hide them in plain sight. The bricked-up doorway would look like a structural repair, a precaution against the chimney collapse he had secretly engineered by removing key support stones. His sons would see rubble, would see a sealed passage, would conclude that their father had merely shored up a failing wall. They would never suspect that behind the brick lay a cathedral of glass, a forest of green, the single most important private botanical collection in Virginia. The final entry was dated October 3, 1839. The work is done. The wing is sealed. They will think it is merely a precaution against the chimney. They will never know what sleeps inside. I have hired the Fenwick family to maintain the exterior drainage. They are good people, mountain people, people who understand that some things must be tended even when the reason is not explained. I have left one key, only one, for the day when someone with a gentler hand, a quieter heart finds this place. Let them be the keeper of my dawns. At the bottom of the page beneath the final line was a small ink drawing, the journal itself rendered in miniature, with an arrow pointing to the spine. Verity's hands moved before her mind caught up. She took the whittling knife from Calvin's toolkit, smaller than the pry bar, sharper design for precision. She turned the journal on its side. The spine was thick, the leather wrapping it old but intact. She slid the blade along the inner edge of the spine's leather covering, cutting carefully the way Calvin would have cut, controlled, deliberate, following the grain. The leather parted. Beneath it, glued to the spine with a substance that had dried to a brittle amber, was a narrow channel carved into the board, a hidden compartment built into the book's own skeleton. Something hard, something cool, something that had waited 43 years for this exact moment, slid out of the channel onto her palm. A key. Small. Ornate. Blackened iron worked into a pattern of leaves of petals by a locksmith who understood that some doors guard more than rooms. The bow of the key was shaped like a flower in orchids, she realized. A lady's slipper. She closed her fist around it. The iron was cold. The cold traveled up her arm, into her shoulder, into the hollow behind her sternum where the stone of grief had lived since Calvin's death. It did not warm the stone, it replaced it. The weight in her chest was no longer grief. It was purpose. Then the sky broke open. The storm announced itself, not with the gradual buildup of clouds that Virginia's mountain weather typically provided, but with a sudden violent darkening, as though a hand had reached across the sky, drawn a black curtain from the western ridge to the eastern valley wall. The wind arrived first, hitting Briarcliff Hall with the force of something personal, something aimed. It did not blow around the house. It struck at a fist of air that rattled every remaining window, that sent loose slates skittering off the roof like cards dealt by a careless hand, that found every crack, every gap, every weakness in the structure Verity had spent weeks reinforcing. Rain followed. Not the steady soaking rain of ordinary autumn storms, but a torrential horizontal assault water, driven sideways by the wind water that did not fall so much as charge, that hit the windows like gravel thrown by an angry crowd. Within minutes, the scullery roof, the one she had patched with salvaged slates, the repair she had been proudest of, began to leak. Not drip. Pour. A section of her careful patchwork lifted, peeled back by the wind, creating an opening through which water cascaded onto the stone floor in a sheet of cold silver. She worked through the night. There was no choice. The house was under siege, her presence, the only defense standing between the structure, its destruction. She hauled buckets. She dragged oilcloths from the stable. She redirected water flows with boards, with rags, with her own hands numb, blue shaking, but still capable of holding a hammer, still capable of driving a nail. A window in the great hall, one she had not yet repaired, shattered inward, the glass flying through the darkness like shrapnel. The wind roared through the breach, a living presence that seemed to carry intelligence, malice, a determination to tear the house apart from the inside. She dragged a massive oak sideboard, a piece of furniture she could barely move when the house was calm, across the floor, wedging it against the broken window, with a strength born not of muscle, but of fury. She was no longer a widow occupying a ruin. She was the ruin's last line of defense. Hours passed. The storm did not relent. Verity moved through the house in a state beyond exhaustion, beyond fear, a state in which the body operates on reserves the mind did not know existed. She sealed breaches. She bailed water. She braced walls. She talked to the house, not in words, not in sentences, but in the language of action, the language of hands that refused to let go. The pounding came at 2 a.m. Not the wind, not rain against glass, a fist against wood. Human knuckles striking the great oak doors with a desperation that cut through the storm's roar like a blade. Briar, who had been shadowing her through every room, Hackle's raised tail low, let out a single bark, not aggressive but alert, the bark of a dog who has identified something that requires its master's attention. She unbarred the door. The effort nearly defeated her. The bar was slick with moisture. Her hands were numb. The wind was pressing against the door from outside with the weight of a living body. She braced her feet, hauled, felt the bar slide free. The door swung inward. A man stood on the threshold, drenched beyond the capacity of fabric to absorb water, his clothes clinging to his frame like a second skin, his hair plastered to his skull, his eyes white-rimmed with the particular terror of a person who has been genuinely afraid for the lives of people he loves. Behind him, sheltering in the minimal lee of the doorway, a woman crouched over 2 small children, her body curved into a shield, her arms wrapped around them with the ferocity of a mother whose instinct has compressed every complex emotion into a single imperative: protect. Please. The man's voice was barely audible above the wind. Our wagon overturned in the lane, the axle snapped. We saw your light. Please. Verity did not hesitate. Hesitation was a luxury available to people who had not spent the last hours fighting to keep a house standing. She stepped aside, held the door, held the lantern high. Get inside, all of you, now. She led them the Pembertons. She would learn a carpenter's family from the next valley, traveling home from a cousin's christening, when the storm caught them on the open road to her small room. The only warm room. The room she had claimed from the ruin, the room with the fire she had built on her 3rd night. The room that represented every victory she had won against the house's decades of neglect. She gave them everything. Her dry blankets, her firewood. The last of her cornmeal mixed with water heated over flames she fed until they roared. A pot of coffee, the final precious scoop from her diminishing supply, brewed strong, served in the only 2 cups she owned, shared between a shivering man, his weeping wife. The children, a boy of 6, a girl of 4, watched her with the wide, unblinking eyes of small creatures who have been frightened, but now sense that the frightening thing has passed. The girl gravitated toward Briar with the unerring instinct children have for identifying the safest presence in a room. The old lurcher submitted to her attention, with the patient dignity of his breed lying still, while she buried her small, cold hands in his thick fur, her small body curling against his warmth until her eyes closed. Her breathing steadied, her fear dissolved into the deep, trusting sleep that only children can achieve in the presence of a good dog. Mrs. Pemberton reached across the narrow space, gripped Verity's hand. The woman's fingers were ice. Her face was streaked with tears, with rain, with the residue of a terror that would take days to fully release its hold. She said nothing. The grip said everything. Verity sat on the stone floor, her back against the wall, watching the fire consume the wood she had gathered that morning. The wood she had planned to ration through the week now burning freely, because warmth given to strangers is never wasted. The house groaned around them, the storm battering its walls with undiminished fury. But the small room held. The fire held. The walls her labor had reinforced held. Briarcliff Hall, for the first time in 50 years, was doing what houses are built to do. It was sheltering people. It was keeping them alive. Something shifted in Verity's understanding, not gradually, but all at once, the way a key turns in a lock. She had been thinking of the house as a problem to be solved, an obstacle to be overcome, a ruin to be conquered. She had been fighting it, but the house was not her enemy. It was her charge. Her father had known this. Blackwell had known it before him. Its purpose, the purpose Blackwell had built into its bones, the purpose her father had sensed across years of correspondence with a man he never met in person, was to protect, to shelter, to keep alive what the world outside threatened to destroy. The storm broke at dawn. The silence that followed was so sudden, so complete, it felt like a physical pressure, the absence of noise pressing against the eardrums, with the same force the noise itself had exerted. Verity opened the main doors to a world scrubbed clean, glistening, stunned into stillness. The mountains were sharp against a sky so pale it looked like bleached linen. Every surface, every stone, every leaf, every blade of grass was coated in a layer of moisture that caught the first light, turned the entire landscape into a field of cold diamonds. The Pembertons departed mid-morning after the mud had firmed enough for walking. Mr. Pemberton stood in the courtyard, his hat in his hands, his face carrying an expression Verity had learned to recognize during her weeks in the Blue Ridge, the expression of a mountain man confronting a debt he considers sacred. His voice was quiet, roughened by the night's ordeal. "I'm a carpenter by trade, Mrs. Hollis, framing roofing finish work. I build things." He looked at the house, at the damaged roof, the shattered window, the fresh scars the storm had carved into the stone. "You saved my family last night. My children slept warm because of you. That's a debt I intend to pay." He replaced his hat. "I'll be back within the week, with lumber, with tools, with my 2 brothers. We'll fix your roof properly, not patches, not salvage, a proper repair. No charge, no argument." He met her eyes. "That's not charity, ma'am. That's account settling." They left. She watched them go, 4 figures diminishing down the lane, the children walking between their parents, the boy holding his father's hand, the girl clutching a wildflower she had picked from the courtyard, their silhouettes growing smaller until the green tunnel of the lane swallowed them. She stood in the silence they left behind, Briar at her side, the morning sun warming the stone at her feet. The peace lasted 3 hours. Calder's mule appeared at the gate before noon, moving faster than she had ever seen it move, the beast's usual philosophical indifference replaced by the agitated trot of an animal, responding to the urgency of its rider. Calder himself was off the cart before it stopped, his long legs covering the courtyard, in strides that ate ground like a man racing a fire. The storm opened something up. He was breathing hard, not from exertion, but from excitement, from the barely contained electricity of a man who has found something he did not expect to find. "The chimney in your room, the servants' quarters. The wind must have shifted the stones. I came to check the structural damage, make sure the flue was still sound." He stopped walking. He stopped breathing. He looked at her with eyes that held the particular intensity of a man standing at the edge of a revelation. "There's a tin box behind the fire brick. The mortar cracked when the chimney shifted in the wind. The box was behind the mortar, sealed in the wall." They went inside together. The fireplace in her room, The fireplace where she had built her first fire, where she had cooked cornmeal, where she had sat through countless evenings with Briar listening to the tapping in the walls, showed a fresh crack running vertically through the fire brick at the back of the firebox. The crack was narrow but deep, the storm's violence having shifted the chimney stack enough to break the mortar seal that had held for decades. Calder produced a chisel from his coat. The man carried tools, the way other men carried handkerchiefs, inserted it into the crack pried. Bricks shifted. Behind them, wedged into a cavity in the chimney wall, was a tin box. Blue, dented, the size of a cigar box, soldered shut. Calder handed it to her without a word. She carried it to the table. She used Calvin's whittling knife to cut through the solder-soft metal, old, yielding easily to the blade. The lid came free. Inside, folded in oilskin that had kept the contents bone dry despite 4 decades sealed in stone, was a single document. Heavy paper, dense handwriting, the same hand as the journal, the same hand as the map, the same hand as the letter to her father. Josiah Blackwell's hand. The document was headed with a single line, Last Will Codicil, the Testament of Josiah Blackwell. This 14th day of September 1839. It was a supplementary will. Not the primary estate document that presumably had been filed with the courts, had divided the land, the timber rights, the house itself among Blackwell's sons. This was something else, something hidden, something meant to survive outside the official channels, outside the reach of the sons who would have destroyed it. The language was precise, legal, clearly composed by a man who had consulted with someone who understood the law, even if the document itself had never been filed with a court. I, Josiah Blackwell, being of sound mind, do hereby declare that the east wing of the property known as Briarcliff Hall, together with all contents therein, including but not limited to the conservatory, all botanical specimens, all equipment, all records, belong solely, irrevocably, in perpetuity, to the person who discovers this document, holds the key to the east wing door, opens said door. This bequest is separate from superior to any claim by my legal heirs or their successors. The east wing is not part of the estate. It is my personal creation, funded by my personal resources, constructed by my own labor with the assistance of hired men, paid from my personal accounts. It is mine to give. I give it to the keeper. At the bottom, 2 signatures witnessed the document. One was illegible, a scrawl that time had reduced to a series of ink-stained loops. The other was clear, firm, written in a hand accustomed to signing things of consequence. Samuel Fenwick, Mrs. Fenwick's grandfather, the man Blackwell had hired to keep the east wing breathing, the man whose descendants had maintained the rainwater drainage for decades without knowing why. I had not merely been a caretaker. He had been a witness, a legal witness to a document that, if upheld, would invalidate every claim Desmond Hollis could bring against the contents of the east wing. Verity set the document on the table beside the journal, beside the key, beside the letter from her father. The pieces were assembling not into a neat picture, but into a weapon, a defense, a shield forged from the foresight of a dead man, tempered by the loyalty of a mountain family, placed in the hands of a widow who had been given 60 days to surrender. Calder pointed to the final paragraph of the codicil, a section she had not yet read. His finger trembled, not with age, but with the significance of what the words contained. Condition: the person holding this key must open the east wing door within 1 calendar year of taking possession of Briarcliff Hall. Should the door remain unopened beyond this period, all rights described herein shall revert to the last living descendant of the Fenwick family in recognition of their decades of faithful service. 1 year. She had taken possession in August 1882. The calendar year expired August 1883. That was months away. The deadline was not imminent. But Desmond's 60-day ultimatum was. She had 19 days remaining. 19 days before his attorney filed the lawsuit. 19 days before the legal machinery of the Commonwealth of Virginia began grinding her between its gears. She looked at Calder. He looked at the key on the table. Neither spoke. The calculus was obvious. She needed to open the east wing before Desmond's lawsuit could strip her of the right to do so. She needed to discover what Blackwell had hidden, had protected, had sealed away from his own sons before those sons' descendants could claim it. The key lay on the scarred wooden table, catching the firelight. The storm had passed. The house was damaged but standing. The Pembertons were safe. The codicil was in her hands. The 60-day clock was ticking. 19 days separated her from Desmond's legal assault. Behind a wall of brick at the end of a long corridor, behind a door she had not yet found, behind 4 decades of silence, something was alive. Something was breathing. Something was waiting. She picked up the key. The iron flower pressed into her palm petals leaves the delicate structure of an orchid cast in metal by a locksmith who had understood his commission. She closed her fingers around it. Tomorrow she would find the door. Tonight the house was quiet. The tapping had stopped for the first time since her arrival. The walls were silent. As though the house, having delivered its message, having placed every piece of evidence in her hands, had finally exhausted its patience, its prompts, its decades-long campaign of whispered invitation. It was done speaking. It was waiting for her to act. Briar lifted his head from the hearth, his old steady eyes catching the firelight, reflecting it back in twin points of warm gold. She rested her hand on his rough skull. Outside, the last light of the storm-washed day slid behind the Blue Ridge, painting the sky in shades of violet, of rose, of the palest, most fragile lilac, the color she realized that Josiah Blackwell had spent his entire life trying to capture in a flower. The color of a winter dawn. She rose before the sun. The fire had burned to a bed of white ash overnight, the room holding just enough residual warmth to keep the cold from settling into her bones completely. Briar was already awake, standing at the door with the quiet expectancy of a dog who senses that the day ahead will be different from the ones that came before. She dressed in the half-darkness, the same black morning dress, the same worn boots, the same thin shawl that had served as window-covering blanket glass guard since her arrival. She did not eat. Hunger had become a familiar companion over these weeks, a presence she acknowledged without obeying. There would be time for food later. There would be time for everything later, or there would be time for nothing at all. The key was in her pocket. The morning was waiting. She walked through the ground floor of Briarcliff Hall with the deliberate pace of a woman retracing steps she had taken many times, but never with this specific destination in mind. Past the great hall where the portrait of Josiah Blackwell watched from its tilted frame. She met his painted eyes as she passed, held them for a moment, felt something pass between the living woman, the rendered image of a dead man that was neither greeting nor permission, but acknowledgement. Past the dining room with its dust-furred china, past the study with the botanical map, into the long corridor that ran the full length of the ground floor east to west, a spine of stone connecting the habitable west wing to the sealed mysteries of the east. The corridor darkened as she moved east. The windows here had been boarded over not with the haphazard planking of neglect, but with deliberate, careful carpentry. The boards were thick-nailed from the inside, placed to prevent light from revealing what lay beyond. Josiah Blackwell had sealed his secret with the methodical thoroughness of a man who understood that his own sons were the enemy. She trailed her fingers along the corridor wall, feeling the texture change beneath her hand plaster, giving way to bare stone, giving way to brick. The brick was different from the house's original construction. Newer, rougher, laid in a pattern that spoke of haste, of urgency, of a man working against a deadline, imposed not by a solicitor's letter, but by the approaching certainty of his own death. The corridor ended at a wall, not a door, not an arch. A wall floor to ceiling, side to side, constructed of the same rough brick, plastered over with a thin coat of whitewash that had cracked, yellowed, begun to flake away in patches. To any casual observer, to any son inspecting his inheritance, to any subsequent owner walking the halls, this would appear to be the end of the corridor. A structural wall, a dead end, nothing more. But set into the wall at waist height, so small it could be mistaken for a coal chute, for a ventilation grate, for any of the minor architectural details that populate old houses, without attracting attention, was a door, iron-plated, no larger than a bread box. A single keyhole in its center, the metal around it showing the faintest trace of wear, not from use but from the passage of air through the mechanism, 43 years of mountain drafts, polishing the brass interior of the lock to a dull gleam. She knelt. The stone floor was cold through the fabric of her dress, the chill climbing through her knees into her thighs. She removed the key from her pocket. The iron flower rested in her palm, orchid petals cast in metal, a locksmith's tribute to the obsession of the man who had commissioned it. She inserted it into the keyhole. The fit was precise. The key slid home with the smooth, inevitable motion of something returning to the place it was made for. She turned it. The mechanism resisted rust, mineral deposits, the accumulated friction of decades without oil. She applied more force, both hands now on the key's bow. Her wrists braced, her shoulders set. The lock groaned. She felt movement tumblers shifting inside the housing pins, aligning the internal geometry of the lock, rearranging itself to accommodate the key's authority. A sound like a gunshot, sharp metallic final, echoed down the corridor as the bolt released. She pulled the iron door open. It swung outward on hinges that screamed in protest, the sound so loud in the silent house that Briar flattened his ears against his skull. Behind the door, darkness. A rectangle of black so complete it seemed solid, not an absence of light, but a presence of something denser. The air that flowed through the opening was different from any air she had breathed inside Briarcliff. Cool, humid, carrying a fragrance that stopped her heart for a beat, not because it was unpleasant, but because it was alive. Damp earth, green growth, the mineral sweetness of water moving through stone. Something floral beneath it all, faint but unmistakable, the olfactory signature of living plants exhaling in darkness. She fetched her lantern from the servants' quarters, lit it with steady hands, returned to the iron door. Briar pressed against her leg, his body trembling, not with fear, but with the electric anticipation of a hunting dog who has found the scent. She held the lantern through the opening, let its light push into the darkness beyond. The space revealed itself in stages, the way a landscape reveals itself at dawn. Edges first, then shapes, then colors, then the overwhelming totality of the scene. She was looking into what had once been a ballroom. The proportions told her that the height of the ceiling, the width of the floor, the distant suggestion of ornamental molding along the upper walls. But the ballroom had been utterly magnificently transformed. The far wall was gone. In its place rose a structure of glass, a conservatory wall that curved upward from the floor to the ceiling, 3 stories above a single continuous sweep of panes held in iron frames, the glass clouded by decades of mineral deposits on the exterior, but still translucent, still admitting the pale light of early morning in long filtered shafts that fell across the interior like the light inside a cathedral. The glass wall faced east. The rising sun was behind it, its rays diffused by the grime into a soft, pearl-colored luminescence that filled the space without casting shadows. Below the glass in the pearlescent light, the orchids waited. She climbed through the iron door. It was too small to walk through, requiring her to duck, to twist, to pull herself through the opening with a gracelessness that would have been comic under other circumstances. She straightened on the other side. She lifted the lantern. She looked. Ranks of wooden tables, sturdy hand-built, the joinery precise, filled the floor of the former ballroom in orderly rows. On the tables, in clay pots of varying sizes, hundreds of plants grew. Not the dried, brittle remains of plants. Not the brown, desiccated husks she would have expected after 4 decades without human care. Living plants. Their leaves were thick, leathery, a deep, glossy green that spoke of adequate moisture, of sufficient light, of the patient, autonomous functioning of the system Josiah Blackwell had designed to sustain them. She moved between the tables, the lantern unnecessary. Now the morning light through the glass wall was strengthening the pearl, giving way to gold. The gold filling the conservatory with a warmth that was not merely thermal, but emotional. The warmth of a place that had been holding its breath for 43 years, finally exhaling. The copper cisterns were visible overhead, large, vertigrized with age, mounted on iron brackets near the ceiling. Pipes ran from them in a branching network, descending to the tables, terminating in narrow clay nozzles positioned above each pot. Water collected from the roof, filtered through gravel beds she could see in copper trays near the base of the wall, dripped from the nozzles in a slow, steady rhythm. The same rhythm she had heard through the walls on her first night. The tapping was not the house speaking. It was the house breathing. It was the irrigation system Blackwell had built, doing what it had been designed to do, keeping his children alive. The foundation vents were visible along the base of the glass wall. Iron louvers, their mechanism simple but effective. Opening with warmth, closing with cold, driven by the expansion-contraction of the metal strips Blackwell had calibrated to Virginia's mountain temperatures. They circulated air without electricity, without steam power, without any energy source other than the daily swing between the mountain's cold nights, its warmer days. It was engineering born not from formal education, but from decades of observation, of trial, of the intimate knowledge a man accumulates when he spends his life watching how living things respond to their environment. Not every plant had survived. She could see the failures pots containing only dry soil stems that had withered to brown threads, the casualties of 4 decades without the supplementary care that even the most ingenious system could not fully replace. Mrs. Fenwick's family had maintained the exterior drainage for 30 years. The 20 years since the last Fenwick had climbed the hill had taken a toll. Perhaps a third of the collection had perished, but two-thirds had not. Two-thirds of Josiah Blackwell's life's work, hundreds of orchids native species collected from every mountain range in the American East had survived. She reached the center of the conservatory. Here on a raised stone dais, a platform built with the deliberate elevation of an altar, positioned to receive the maximum light from the glass wall, stood a cluster of pots larger than the others. The plants in them were different, taller, their leaves broader, more robust, carrying a luster that the others lacked. These were not wild collected specimens. These were cultivated, bred. The product of the hybridization program Blackwell had documented in his journal, the decades of cross-pollination of failed experiments of patient obsessive refinement. Several of them were in bloom. The flowers were unlike anything she had encountered in her father's pressed flower collections, in the botanical illustrations she had studied as a girl in the wildflower meadows of Albemarle County, where she had spent her childhood learning the names of living things. The blooms were the size of a woman's cupped hand, larger than any native orchid she knew, with a structure that combined the pouch-shaped labellum of a lady's slipper with the spreading lateral petals of a species she could not identify. The color was extraordinary. The palest lilac so faint it was almost white, deepening toward the center to a translucent amethyst. The petals were veined not with the dark lines common to most orchids, but with threads of silver. Actual silver, a metallic sheen that caught the morning light, that shifted as the angle of illumination changed, that gave each flower the appearance of being lit from within. She leaned closer. The scent reached her. Not the heavy, cloying perfume of hothouse orchids she had smelled once in a Richmond conservatory, but something entirely different. Light. Clean. Honey. Honey, yes, the sweetness of raw, unprocessed honey from mountain apiaries. Rain, the mineral freshness of water falling through clean air onto warm stone. Something else beneath both, a quality she could not name that Blackwell himself had struggled to name in his journal, the smell of light passing through morning mist. She understood now why he had called them his dawns. Each flower was a sunrise captured in living tissue, a moment of beauty so specific, so ephemeral in nature, that only a man who had watched 10,000 mountain mornings could have conceived of reproducing it in a flower. Cypripedium briarcliffense, the briarcliff orchid. It existed. It had survived. It was blooming. She wept. The tears came without warning, without buildup, without the usual preliminary tightening of the throat that preceded the controlled grief she had permitted herself in private moments. These tears were different. They were not for Calvin, not for her father, not for the life she had lost, the family that had rejected her, the months of cold labor humiliation she had endured. They were for beauty, for the staggering, improbable, defiant beauty of flowers blooming in a sealed room after 43 years of solitude, for the man who had loved them enough to build them an ark, for the chain of people, Blackwell, the Fenwicks, her father called her, the solicitor, Cobb, who had each in their own way across decades, across the gap between generations, conspired to bring her to this exact spot at this exact moment. She stood on the dais among the silver-veined orchids, her lantern forgotten on the floor, her face wet, her chest, heaving, crying with the unrestrained, graceless honesty of a person who has been holding something back for so long that its release is not a choice but an event. A dam breaking a season, turning a dawn, arriving after the longest night. Briar found her there. He had squeezed through the iron door, an effort that cost him dignity but not determination. Picked his way between the tables, his nails clicking on the stone floor, his eyes wide at the strangeness of this green, humid world hidden inside the house he had been living in for months. He pressed his muzzle into her hand. His nose was cold. His presence was the warmest thing in the room. News traveled from Briarcliff Hall the way fire travels through dry grass, fast, unpredictable, impossible to contain. The vector was Mr. Pemberton, who returned 3 days after the storm as promised, accompanied by his 2 brothers, a wagon load of lumber, enough nails to shoe every horse in the county. He had come to fix the roof. He found a woman standing in a cathedral of glass surrounded by flowers that should not exist, holding a key that had been hidden in a dead man's book for 4 decades. Pemberton was a carpenter, a practical man, a man who measured the world in board feet and plumb lines in the satisfying right angle of a properly framed wall. The conservatory left him speechless, not because he understood its botanical significance, but because he recognized craftsmanship. The tables, the cisterns, the pipe network, the louver mechanisms, these were the work of a builder. A builder working alone in secret with the kind of obsessive precision that Pemberton himself aspired to, but had never achieved at this scale. He removed his hat. He stood in the filtered light among the orchids, turning slowly, taking in the scope of what one man had constructed, had hidden, had entrusted to time, to luck, to the quiet persistence of a young woman who had arrived with nothing but a dog, a trunk, a refusal to surrender. He told his brothers. His brothers told their wives. Their wives told the women at the Dunmore General Store. By the end of the week, the story had reached every household within 10 miles of the village, carried not by malice or gossip, but by the particular urgent excitement that seizes a small community when something genuinely extraordinary happens in its midst. The widow Hollis had found a hidden garden, a glass palace full of flowers sealed inside the ruined east wing, a treasure buried by a dead man, guarded by an old woman's family for generations. It was the kind of story that mountain people whose lives were governed by the slow cyclical rhythms of planting, harvesting, weathering, enduring, recognized as belonging to a different order of narrative. Not ordinary, not daily. The kind of story that becomes local legend that grandparents tell grandchildren on winter evenings, that grows with each telling but never needs embellishment, because the truth is already extraordinary enough. The shift in Dunmore's attitude toward Verity was not gradual. It was tectonic, a sudden wholesale realignment of the social landscape, the ground itself moving beneath the feet of people who had spent months treating her as an object of pity, of mockery, of the comfortable contempt that small communities extend to those they have decided will not last. She was no longer the fool who had accepted a ruin. She was the woman who had unlocked a miracle. The baker no longer muttered excuses when he added bread to her order. He met her eyes. The blacksmith's wife no longer left anonymous gifts on fence posts. She knocked on the door of Briarcliff Hall, introduced herself properly. Martha Ames, pleased to meet you, brought a jar of apple butter, stayed for coffee. Garvey, the shopkeeper, who had obeyed Desmond's instruction to deny her credit, now extended it without being asked his ledger. Open his pen ready, his cowardice transmuted by circumstance into something that resembled, if not courage, at least the absence of active obstruction. Mr. Stratton arrived on a Tuesday. He came by carriage from Charlottesville, a journey of several hours over mountain roads that tested the springs of his vehicle, the patience of his driver, the resilience of his 70-year-old spine. He was a solicitor of the old school, tall, thin, white-haired, dressed in a black coat that had been fashionable during the administration of President Buchanan. His reputation preceded him through the valley like a weather front. Stratton was honest. Stratton was incorruptible. Stratton had once refused a retainer from a railroad company because he believed their land acquisition practices were fraudulent. A refusal that had cost him a fortune earned him something more valuable than money. Trust. He had heard the story. Everyone had heard the story. But Stratton was not a man who acted on stories. He acted on evidence. He had come to see. Verity led him through the iron door. She had widened it slightly in the days since her discovery, using Pemberton's tools, with Pemberton's assistance, removing enough brick to allow passage without the undignified contortion her first entry had required. Stratton ducked through the opening, straightened on the other side, lifted his eyes to the glass wall 3 stories above, lowered them to the rows of orchids stretching across the ballroom floor. He was silent for a long time. He walked the rows slowly, his hands clasped behind his back, his head inclined toward the plants, with the attentive posture of a man who, while not a botanist himself, understood that he was in the presence of something that demanded respect. He paused at the dais. He studied the Briarcliff orchids, their silver-veined petals, their impossible color, the quiet, persistent miracle of their survival. He inhaled their scent. His eyes closed briefly. Mrs. Hollis. His voice carried the careful weight of professional understatement, the voice of a man who had spent 50 years choosing words the way a surgeon chooses instruments. Do you understand what you have here? This is not merely a collection of flowers. This is one of the most significant private botanical assemblages in the United States. The Briarcliff orchid alone, if it is indeed a stable hybrid, if it breeds true, represents a discovery of national importance. He turned to face her. His expression was the expression of a man who has been practicing law for half a century, who has seen greed destroy families, who has watched inheritance tear apart bonds that blood should have held sacred, who recognizes in this moment the rare, almost unprecedented spectacle of justice, arriving not through the courts, but through a locked door, a hidden key, the stubborn patience of a woman no one believed in. Its value, Mrs. Hollis, is incalculable. The word hung in the humid air of the conservatory. Incalculable. Not priceless, that was a word for auction houses, for catalogs, for the language of commerce. Incalculable beyond the capacity of numbers, to contain beyond the reach of ledgers, beyond the arithmetic of men like Desmond Hollis, who measured the world in dollars and board feet, in the $5 insult that had been intended to purchase her defeat. She showed Stratton the journal, the codicil, the letter from Blackwell to her father. She laid the documents on one of Blackwell's tables between the orchid pots, the morning light falling across the faded ink. Stratton read each document twice. His expression did not change. Lawyers of his generation maintained facial neutrality, the way soldiers maintain formation as a professional obligation. But his hands, she noticed, trembled slightly as he turned the pages of the codicil. He recognized what he was holding, a weapon. The codicil is unusual. His voice was measured, clinical. Handwritten, not filed with any court, not notarized. Under Virginia law, a holographic will written entirely in the testator's own hand can be valid without notarization, provided it can be authenticated. The handwriting must be confirmed as the testator's. The witnesses must be verified. He tapped the signature at the bottom of the document, Samuel Fenwick. This witness, can you establish his identity? Verity could. She knew exactly who could establish it. She had been waiting for this question the way a chess player waits for an opponent to move into the anticipated square. Desmond Hollis arrived 11 days before his own deadline. He came not by public coach, not by hired carriage, but in a private Brougham-polished black lacquer brass fittings, a matched pair of bay horses that cost more than most Dunmore families earned in a year. The vehicle ground to a halt in Briarcliff's courtyard, its wheels sinking into the mud that no amount of drainage work had yet fully conquered. Beside him sat a man Verity had not met, but recognized by type, thin, sharp-faced, carrying a leather portfolio with the protective grip of a man who considers documents to be ammunition. Desmond's attorney, J. Pembroke Crawford, Esquire, the man who had drafted the 60-day ultimatum, who had sharpened its language to a legal point designed to pierce whatever fragile defenses a penniless widow might construct. Desmond stepped down from the carriage. His boots, new expensive, entirely unsuitable for mud, sank immediately. The expression on his face was complex, a layered construction of disbelief, fury, calculation, the specific outrage of a man who has designed a trap, watched his prey, walk into it, then watch the trap spring in the wrong direction. He had heard the story. He had come to verify it. He had come to claim it. He did not greet Verity. He did not acknowledge the house's improved condition. The new roof sections, Pemberton's crew had installed the reglazed windows, the cleared courtyard, the evidence of competent, sustained labor that contradicted every assumption upon which his legal strategy depended. He walked past her as though she were furniture, his attorney trailing behind the portfolio clutched to his chest. Show me. 2 words, stripped of the false cheerfulness, the mocking concern, the performative cruelty that had characterized every previous interaction. Raw command, the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed. She showed him. She led them through the widened doorway into the conservatory, stepping aside to let the morning light do the work of persuasion that no words could accomplish. Desmond entered. He stopped. His attorney, following too closely, collided with his back. Neither noticed. The conservatory in full morning light was a spectacle that defeated cynicism. The glass wall clean now, Verity having spent 3 days on a ladder with vinegar, old newspapers removing 4 decades of mineral deposits from the exterior panes, admitted the sun without obstruction. The light fell in broad, warm columns across the rows of orchids, illuminating the green of their leaves, the occasional punctuation of bloom, the copper gleam of the cisterns overhead. The air was warm, humid, fragrant, a different climate entirely from the mountain cold, outside a pocket of sustained life, in the midst of a landscape preparing for winter. The irrigation system clicked, dripped, breathed the quiet, persistent heartbeat of a machine designed by a genius, maintained by gravity, sustained by rain. Desmond walked the rows. His face changed as he moved, the initial shock giving way to calculation giving way to something uglier. She recognized the expression. She had seen it described in Blackwell's journal, the look of a man who sees beauty understands only its price. Desmond was not seeing orchids. He was seeing assets. He was performing mental arithmetic, converting petals to dollars, rarity to market value, 43 years of secret cultivation, into a figure he could present to buyers in New York and Philadelphia, in the auction houses where wealthy collectors competed for botanical trophies. He reached the dais. He looked at the Briarcliff orchids. The silver-veined petals caught the light, shimmering with that metallic luminescence that made each flower appear self-illuminated. He stared at them for a long time. Something moved behind his eyes, not appreciation, not wonder, but the cold, rapid processing of a man calculating return on investment. He turned to Verity. His voice had changed, the boom replaced by something quieter, more dangerous. These were on the property when you took possession. The deed transfers the property in its entirety, structure, contents, fixtures. Everything inside these walls belongs to whoever holds the deed. He paused, a smile thin, predatory. The deed, Mrs. Hollis, was a gift from the Hollis family. The contents of this wing are therefore part of the Hollis estate. My attorney will be filing a claim for recovery of family assets by the end of the week. Crawford opened his portfolio, produced a document already drafted, already prepared, the legal framework for exactly this argument, constructed before they had even arrived. The man had anticipated the discovery, had prepared for it. Desmond's 60-day ultimatum had never been about the house's disrepair. It had been about this, about creating a legal pretext to reclaim whatever the East Wing contained. The Hollis family had always suspected. Desmond's father, Blackwell's grandson, had tried to breach the sealed doorway decades ago, had found no way through. The brick had concluded eventually that whatever the old man had hidden was either worthless or inaccessible. But he had never been certain. The uncertainty had passed from father to son like a family heirloom of greed, each generation wondering, none willing to spend the money to demolish the wall, all waiting for someone else to do the work. Verity had done the work. Now Desmond wanted the reward. She let him finish. She let Crawford present his argument, the legal theory articulated with the practiced fluency of a man who charged by the hour, who understood that thoroughness was indistinguishable from intimidation when deployed against an opponent without resources. She stood with her hands at her sides, her face carrying the same locked door expression she had worn in Cobb's office in Richmond, the same controlled stillness that had met Desmond's mockery in Garvey's store. When Crawford concluded, she spoke. Her voice was quiet, quieter than the dripping of the irrigation system, quieter than the breathing of the orchids. Mr. Stratton, the solicitor from Charlottesville, stepped through the doorway behind them. He had been waiting, positioned in the corridor by prior arrangement, listening to Crawford's presentation with the patient attention of a man who prefers to let his opponents commit fully to their position before revealing that the position is built on sand. He carried no portfolio. He carried 3 documents held loosely in one hand, the way a card player holds a winning hand, without urgency, without display, with the quiet confidence of a man who knows that the game is already over. He placed the first document on the nearest table. The codicil. Blackwell's handwritten supplementary will unfolded, its language visible, its intent unambiguous. The East Wing belongs to the person who discovers this document, holds the key, opens the door. Separate from any claim by legal heirs or their successors. Crawford's eyes moved over the document. His face changed, the professional composure cracking at the edges the way plaster cracks around a nail hole. Stratton placed the second document beside the first. The letter from Blackwell to Verity's father, establishing that Blackwell had intended decades before the transfer of the deed for the East Wing's contents to pass to someone outside his own bloodline. Evidence of intent. Evidence that the East Wing had been excluded from the family estate by the deliberate, premeditated design of its creator. Crawford picked up the letter, read it, set it down. His mouth compressed into a line so thin it nearly disappeared. Stratton did not place the third piece of evidence. He did not need to. The third piece of evidence placed herself. Mrs. Fenwick appeared in the doorway. She moved slowly, her curved spine, her clouded eyes, her gnarled hands, all testifying to the weight of her years. But she moved with purpose. She carried a book, small, leather-bound, water-stained, its pages swollen with the absorbed moisture of decades stored in a mountain farmhouse. Her grandfather's record book. The accounts of Samuel Fenwick, the man Blackwell had hired, the man who had witnessed the codicil, the man whose signature authenticated the document Crawford was now holding with the expression of a surgeon who has opened a patient only to discover that the disease is inoperable. Mrs. Fenwick did not speak to Desmond. She did not acknowledge Crawford. She walked to the table where the documents lay, opened her grandfather's book to a marked page, placed it beside the codicil. The entry was dated September 14th, 1839, the same date as the codicil. The handwriting was different from Blackwell's, rougher, less educated, the script of a working man who had learned letters late in life. But the content was unambiguous, signed as witness today for Mr. Blackwell. He has sealed the east wing, paid in full for maintenance of the drainage, the vents, to continue until no Fenwick remains to do the work. God willing, someone will come for the flowers. She straightened slowly, painfully turned to face Stratton. Her voice was the thin, reedy instrument Verity remembered from the churchyard, but it carried a resonance that filled the conservatory. My grandfather signed that paper. My father honored the agreement after him. I honored it after my father. 3 generations of Fenwicks kept Mr. Blackwell's promise. I am the last. She looked at Verity. The clouded eyes held a clarity that had nothing to do with vision. She is the keeper now. The silence that followed was not empty. It was structural, a silence that bore weight, that supported the moment, the way a keystone supports an arch. Every person in the room understood that the ground had shifted. Crawford knew it. His portfolio now contained ammunition for a gun that could no longer fire. Desmond knew it. His face had drained of color, the flush of good living, replaced by the gray pallor of a man watching a fortune slip through his fingers. Stratton knew it, his expression unchanged, his professional neutrality intact, but his eyes holding the faint, controlled satisfaction of a man who has spent 50 years waiting for the law to produce a moment of genuine justice. Crawford leaned toward Desmond. His voice was barely audible, a murmur intended for his client alone, but the conservatory's acoustics carried it to every ear. The holographic will may be valid under Virginia statute. The witness corroboration is strong. The evidence of testamentary intent is documented across multiple sources. A pause. There is no basis for the claim, Mr. Hollis. Desmond did not respond to his attorney. He stood among the orchids, the living legacy of a grandfather he had never respected, the botanical fortune he had given away for $5 as a joke, the secret that 3 generations of Hollises had suspected, but never confirmed, never pursued, never valued enough to investigate. He looked at the Briarcliff orchids on their dais, their petals luminous in the morning light. He looked at the rows of surviving specimens, hundreds of plants, each one irreplaceable, each one carrying genetic material that existed nowhere else on Earth. He looked at Verity, this slight, quiet, stubborn woman in a worn black dress, her hands stained with mortar, with soil, with the labor of months spent saving a house his family had abandoned. He said nothing. He turned. He walked to the doorway, his expensive boots tracking mud across the stone floor of the conservatory. He ducked through the opening. His footsteps receded down the corridor, measured, deliberate, the footsteps of a man who is not retreating but withdrawing, who understands that the battle is lost but cannot bring himself to concede aloud. The front door of Briarcliff Hall opened, closed. The carriage springs creaked as he climbed aboard. Hooves on mud, wheels turning. The sound diminishing down the lane, growing fainter, consumed by distance, by the green tunnel of Hawthorne, by the Blue Ridge itself, the mountains swallowing the last echo of the Hollis family's claim on a house they had never deserved. Crawford followed his client without a word. His portfolio, she noticed, hung open at his side, the documents inside irrelevant. Now the legal architecture he had constructed, dismantled, not by a counter-argument, but by an old woman's testimony, a dead man's foresight, a tin box hidden in a chimney wall. A year passed. Seasons turned over the Blue Ridge, with the unhurried rhythm that mountain time demands, not the frantic, forward-lurching tempo of cities, but the circular returning pulse of a world governed by bloom, by dormancy, by the patient accumulation of growth that cannot be rushed. Briarcliff Hall changed with the seasons, its transformation so gradual that only someone who had known its worst state could fully appreciate the distance traveled. Verity sold a portion of the collection, the more common species specimens that existed in other collections, plants, whose loss would not diminish the overall significance of what Blackwell had assembled. She contacted the Smithsonian Institution through Stratton, who arranged the transactions with the protective care of a man who understood that the collection's scientific value far exceeded its market price. The funds were modest by Richmond standards, enormous by Dunmore standards, enough to hire Pemberton's crew for a full season of repairs. The roof was restored, not patched, not salvaged, but properly rebuilt, with new slate hauled from a quarry in the next county. The broken windows were replaced. The stonework was repointed. The great oak doors, the doors that had refused Verity entry on her first day, were rehung on new iron hinges, their wood treated with linseed oil until it glowed with a warmth it had not possessed in half a century. The house breathed differently now. The corridors that had been choked with damp with the exhalations of decay now carried the scent of fresh plaster, of new wood, of the beeswax Verity used to polish the surviving furniture. The great hall's portrait of Josiah Blackwell was straightened on its hook. Its frame repaired, its surface cleaned, the stern-faced botanist now gazing down at the restored hall with an expression that seemed in certain lights to have softened from disapproval to something closer to satisfaction. The east wing remained Verity's primary devotion. She learned the names of every species in Blackwell's collection, cross-referencing his journal entries with the botanical text from the pristine bookshelf, building a comprehensive catalog that would eventually be recognized by the Smithsonian as one of the most complete records of native orchid distribution in the Appalachian region. She learned the individual needs of each plant, which required more water, which less, which thrived in the direct morning light that poured through the glass wall, which preferred the dappled shade of the conservatory's deeper corners. She repaired the irrigation system where corrosion had compromised the copper pipes, replacing sections with new tubing purchased with funds from the plant sales. She calibrated the ventilation louvers, adjusting the metal strips that controlled their opening-closing to account for changes in the surrounding tree canopy that had altered the conservatory's thermal profile over 4 decades. She kept the Briarcliff orchids, every single one. She would not sell them. She would not trade them. She would not permit them to be removed from the dais where Blackwell had placed them, the altar he had built for his life's masterwork. When the Smithsonian expressed interest in acquiring specimens for their collection, she declined with the quiet firmness of a woman who understood the difference between surrendering. The orchids would remain at Briarcliff. Researchers were welcome to visit, to study, to document. The flowers themselves would stay where they had been born, in the sealed cathedral their creator had built for them, tended by the keeper he had trusted to find them. Dunmore completed its transformation. Verity was no longer the Richmond widow, the outsider, the object of pity mockery. She was the keeper of Briarcliff, a title that emerged organically from the village's collective vocabulary, spoken not with the ironic distance of a nickname, but with the quiet weight of a designation earned through endurance, through labor, through the specific, undeniable act of having been right when everyone else was wrong. Tradesmen offered her credit without hesitation. Neighbors, people who had avoided her gaze for months, now stopped her in the square to ask about the orchids, about the house, about the old man who had built a glass palace inside a ruin. Children from the village school walked up the lane in supervised groups to see the conservatory, their small faces pressed against the glass wall from outside, their breath fogging the panes, their eyes wide with the particular wonder that children reserve for things they cannot explain. Martha Ames, the blacksmith's wife, the woman of anonymous peaches, of unsigned notes, of the single nod in Garvey's store that had been Verity's first experience of solidarity in Dunmore, became a regular visitor. She brought practical gifts, preserved vegetables, mended fabric, the no-nonsense companionship of a woman who expressed affection through usefulness rather than sentiment. She never mentioned the months of silence, the community's complicity in Verity's isolation. She did not need to. Her presence was the apology. Her consistency was the amendment. On a soft evening in late May, the Blue Ridge at its most generous, the mountains draped in the pale green of new growth, the air heavy with the scent of wild azalea, of dogwood, of the particular sweetness that Virginia produces in the weeks between the last frost, the first heat. Calder came to visit. He arrived on foot. The mule, he explained without being asked, had finally retired, not to the glue factory, but to a neighbor's pasture where it would spend its remaining years in the philosophical contemplation of grass. He had walked the 7 miles from his farm, a journey that would have been unremarkable for a younger man, but that represented for a man of Calder's years a significant commitment of effort, of time, of the physical reserves that age parcels out with increasing reluctance. Verity met him at the gate. Briar, older now, slower, his gray muzzle almost entirely white, recognized the farmer before his mistress did, his tail wagging with the measured enthusiasm of an aged dog who conserves energy for things that matter. She led Calder through the house, through the restored great hall, through the corridor, through the widened doorway, into the conservatory. The late afternoon light was at its most dramatic, the sun lowering toward the western ridge, its rays entering the glass wall at an angle that set the entire space ablaze with gold. The orchids glowed. The copper cisterns caught the light, threw it back in warm reddish flashes. The air was thick with fragrance, the accumulated exhalation of hundreds of living plants. The humid, fertile, unmistakable smell of things, growing of life, persisting of the particular defiance that living things practice against the entropy that would otherwise reduce everything to stillness. Calder walked the rows slowly. His weathered face held an expression she had never seen on it before. Not the controlled concern of their early meetings, not the measured honesty of his confessions, but something unguarded. Wonder. The wonder of a man who had spent his entire life working the soil, who understood growth, who understood the patience required to coax life from reluctant earth, who recognized in this conservatory the work of a kindred spirit. A man who had planted not for profit, not for display, but because planting was the only response to mortality that made sense. He reached the dais. He looked at the Briarcliff orchids. The petals shimmered in the evening light, pale lilac, deepening to amethyst, the metallic threads catching each shift of illumination, each breath of air through the open vents, each subtle movement of the atmosphere in this living breathing room. He stood there for a long time. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who have arrived at the same understanding by different roads, the silence that follows the last piece of a puzzle finding its place. His voice, when it came, was soft, roughened by the 7-mile walk, by the mountain air, by the weight of what he was seeing. They gave you a ruin, Verity. She stood beside him on the dais among the flowers. Briar lay at her feet, his breathing the steady, contented rhythm of a dog who has finally arrived at the place he was always meant to be. The evening light fell across her face, a face changed by the months, by the labor, by the cold, the hunger, the solitude, the discovery. Not harder, not softer, clearer. The face of a woman who had been tested by everything the world could devise, who had answered every test not with defiance but with persistence. The quiet, unglamorous, day-after-day persistence that is the only force strong enough to defeat despair. She reached out, her fingers calloused now, stained with soil, with mortar, with the green residue of orchid stems she had staked, pruned, tended for months, touched the petal of a Briarcliff orchid. The flower responded to her touch with an almost imperceptible tremor, the silver veins scattering the light in a brief, brilliant flash that illuminated her hand, her wrist, bathing her skin in the reflected glow of something precious, something living, something that had waited in the dark for 43 years for exactly this hand. She thought of Desmond's contempt, of the villagers' mockery, of her own despair on the evening she had first seen the house silhouetted against a bruised sky. She thought of Josiah Blackwell, the patient, brilliant, lonely man who had trusted that someone would understand. She thought of Calvin, his carving tools placed in her hands by the family that considered them worthless, the pry bar that opened the bookcase, the whittling knife that freed the key. What we leave behind is not the measure of what we lose, she thought, but the measure of what we were willing to give. She thought of her father, of the invisible architecture of care he had constructed around a daughter he knew he would leave behind. She smiled, not the controlled, careful smile she had worn as armor through months of hardship. A real smile, unguarded, undirected, the smile of a woman who understands at last that the cruelest gift she had ever received was in fact the most generous. The words came quietly, not performed, not announced, spoken to the room, to the flowers, to the memory of a man who had called them his dawns, to the old farmer standing beside her, to the dog at her feet, to the house itself. The house that had waited, that had remembered, that had kept its secret with the patience of stone until the right hands arrived to receive it. They didn't give me the ruin. They gave me the key. In the journal's final page, a page she would return to on difficult mornings, on lonely evenings, on the days when the weight of stewardship pressed hard enough to remind her that purpose is not the same as ease, Josiah Blackwell had written a line she had initially overlooked. A postscript squeezed into the margin, the handwriting smaller than the rest, as though he had added it as a seed planted for a future he could not see. There is a second garden, But that story belongs to the one who finds the first. She closed the journal. The second garden could wait. It would wait the way the first had waited, patiently, faithfully sealed inside some other secret she had not yet discovered, guarded by some other chain of quiet, stubborn, unremarkable people who understood that the most valuable things in this world are not the things we build for ourselves, but the things we protect for those who come after us. Outside above the blue ridge, the stars were appearing. Briar leaned into her side the way he had leaned into Calvin, the way he would continue to lean until the day his own journey ended. Behind them, through the glass wall of the east wing, the Briarcliff orchids glowed faintly in the gathering dusk, the color of a winter dawn, preserved in petals that refused to close. They bloomed on, not because someone owned them, but because someone cared.